Today, I've prepared the biography of Coco Chanel. Before you fall asleep, make sure to tell us from where you're listening and what time it is. Now, calm down and listen to the story while falling asleep. I'm wishing you a cozy and comfortable night. As you settle into your warm bed, let your muscles relax one by one. Tonight, we'll drift through the remarkable life of Gabrielle Coco Chanel, the woman who revolutionized fashion and created an enduring legacy. Her story takes us from humble beginnings to extraordinary heights, a gentle reminder that dreams can unfold in the most unexpected ways. Let her journey accompany you as you drift peacefully into sleep, the soft whisper of her story guiding you toward restful slumber. Your eyelids may feel heavier with each word, and that's perfectly fine. Allow yourself to be carried away by the gentle current of this tale. In the quiet countryside of France, as the 19th century was drawing to a close, a little girl named Gabrielle Chanel came into the world, born on August 19, 1883, in the small town of Sommer. She would one day transform the landscape of fashion forever. But on that summer day, she was simply a newborn, unaware of the remarkable journey that lay ahead of her. The world she entered was one of horse-drawn carriages, oil lamps casting soft golden light across wooden floors, and the gentle rustling of long skirts as women moved through their daily lives. Gabrielle's parents, Henry Albert Chanel and Jean Duval, lived a humble existence. Her father was a market stallholder who traveled from town to town, selling clothing and household goods at local markets. He was a restless soul, never staying in one place for too long, his eyes always looking toward the horizon for the next opportunity. Jean, Gabrielle's mother, was a laundrywoman with delicate hands that had been roughened by years of washing other people's linens in cold water. Despite the hardship of her work, she maintained a certain grace, a quality that her daughter would inherit and later refine into something extraordinary. The Chanel family grew quickly. Gabrielle was one of 6 children, and as the family expanded, their financial struggles deepened. They lived in modest lodgings, often sharing small rooms with simple furnishings. The walls were thin, and in winter, the cold would seep through, making the children huddle together for warmth. Yet, even in these early years, young Gabrielle showed signs of the determined spirit that would later define her. She would watch with curious eyes as her mother sewed by candlelight, mending clothes and making small embellishments to brighten their plain garments. The French countryside of Gabrielle's childhood was a tapestry of rolling green hills, vineyards stretching toward the horizon, and small villages where life moved at an unhurried pace. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from local bakeries, mixing with the earthy fragrance of the land after rainfall. Church bells would ring out across the valleys, marking the hours and calling the faithful to prayer. It was a world of traditions, of routines that had remained unchanged for generations. When Gabrielle was just 12 years old, her life took a sorrowful turn. Her mother, weakened from years of hard labor and successive pregnancies, fell ill with tuberculosis, a disease that claimed many lives in that era before modern medicine. As young Gabrielle sat by her mother's bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, she couldn't have known how this loss would shape her future. Jean passed away at the age of 33, leaving behind her children and a husband ill-equipped to care for them alone. In the aftermath of this profound loss, Henry Albert Chanel made a decision that would alter the course of his daughter's life. Unable to support all his children, he took young Gabrielle and her sisters to the orphanage at the Abbey of Aubazine in central France. The journey was long and quiet, the horses' hooves creating a rhythmic sound on the dirt roads as they traveled away from everything familiar. For Gabrielle, watching the landscape change outside the carriage window, it must have felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The Abbey of Aubazine was a stark contrast to the warmth of family life, no matter how humble that life had been. Founded in the 12th century, the abbey was a place of stone walls and strict routines. The corridors were cold, echoing with the sound of prayers and the soft padding of the nuns' feet as they moved from one duty to the next. Here, in this austere environment, Gabrielle spent her formative years, from age 12 to 18. The nuns who ran the orphanage were kind, but firm, instilling in the girls a sense of discipline and order. Each day began before dawn, with the girls rising to attend morning prayers in the chapel. The stained glass windows would filter the early light, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor as the girls knelt in silent devotion. After prayers came breakfast, simple fare of bread and milk, followed by lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. But it was during the afternoons, when the girls were taught needlework, that young Gabrielle found her first true passion. Under the patient guidance of the nuns, she learned to sew with precision, her fingers growing nimble as she created stitches so fine they were almost invisible. She would sit for hours, back straight as the nuns had taught her, working on her samplers, while sunlight streamed through the high windows of the sewing room. The Abbey's aesthetic would later influence Chanel's design sensibilities in ways she could not have anticipated as a child. The simplicity of the nuns' habits, black and white, unadorned yet dignified, made an impression on her young mind. The clean lines of the Abbey's architecture, the absence of unnecessary ornamentation, the emphasis on function over decoration. All these elements would later emerge in her revolutionary approach to fashion. During these years at Aubazine, Gabrielle also discovered a love for books. The Abbey had a small library, and whenever she could find a moment of solitude, she would lose herself in stories of far-off places and different lives. Reading became an escape from the confines of the orphanage, a way to imagine a world beyond its walls. She particularly loved stories of strong, independent women who forged their own paths, perhaps seeing in them a reflection of the person she hoped to become. When Gabrielle turned 18, it was time to leave the abbey. The nuns had arranged for her to attend a boarding school in the town of Moulins, where she would continue her education and learn skills that would help her find employment. The school was run by the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, and while it maintained the discipline Gabrielle had grown accustomed to, it offered more freedom than the abbey had. In Moulins, Gabrielle's world expanded. The town, though small, was livelier than the isolated abbey. There were shops with windows displaying goods from Paris, cafes where people gathered to discuss politics and art, and a small theater that occasionally hosted traveling performers. During her time at the boarding school, Gabrielle refined her sewing skills and learned the basics of designing and altering clothes. She had a natural eye for what looked good, for the way fabric should drape and how a garment should fit. The sisters noticed her talent and often asked her to help with mending the school uniforms or creating costumes for the school's modest theatrical productions. It was also in Moulins that Gabrielle began to develop her distinctive style, while the other girls dreamed of elaborate dresses with frills and lace. Gabrielle preferred cleaner lines and more practical designs. She would modify her own clothing, removing unnecessary embellishments and adapting them to suit her taste for simplicity. Her fellow students sometimes found her choices odd, but there was something compelling about the quiet confidence with which she wore her altered garments. After completing her education, Gabrielle found work as a seamstress in a local tailor's shop. The shop was small, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and large windows that let in natural light, essential for the detailed work of sewing. Here, she further honed her skills, learning the intricacies of construction and the importance of quality materials. She would spend hours bent over her work, the gentle sound of her needle pulling thread through fabric, a soothing rhythm in the quiet shop. In the evenings and on her days off, Gabrielle would occasionally visit a local cafe that was popular with military officers from the nearby garrison. It was here that she began to supplement her income by singing. Her repertoire included folk songs and popular tunes of the day, sung in a voice that, while not remarkable for its power, had a certain charm and expressiveness that appealed to the cafe's patrons. There are various stories about how this came about. Some say it was derived from the songs she often performed, Coco Raiko and Kwikwavu Coco, while others suggest it was a shortened form of cocotte, a French term for a kept woman. Whatever its origin, the name stuck, and Gabrielle Chanel began her transformation into Coco Chanel. Among the officers who frequented the cafe was Etienne Balsan, a wealthy cavalry officer and heir to a textile fortune. Balsan was drawn to the young woman with the direct gaze and quiet confidence. He saw something special in her, a combination of vulnerability and strength that intrigued him. After several meetings, he invited her to visit his estate, Royalou, near Campigny. For Coco, Balsan's invitation represented an opportunity to step into a different world. Royalou was a sprawling country estate with manicured gardens, stables filled with thoroughbred horses, and rooms decorated with fine art and antiques. It was a far cry from the orphanage of her childhood or the modest boarding school where she had spent her late teens. At Royalou, Coco was introduced to a lifestyle of leisure and luxury. She observed the habits and manners of the upper class, absorbing details that would later inform her understanding of what wealthy women wanted and needed in their wardrobes. She noticed the impracticality of many women's clothes, how they restricted movement and required constant adjustment. She began to imagine garments that would combine elegance with comfort, a revolutionary concept in an era when women's fashion was defined by corsets and elaborate ornamentation. Balsan's circle of friends included wealthy industrialists, artists, and other members of the French elite. Among them was Arthur Boy Capel, an English businessman and polo player. Capel was different from the other men in Balsan's set, more serious, more intellectual, with interests that extended beyond horses and hunting. He and Coco formed a connection that would grow into a significant relationship, both personally and professionally. It was Capel who encouraged Coco to pursue her interest in hat design. He saw her potential and believed in her vision of a different kind of fashion. With his financial backing, she opened her first shop in Paris in 1910, selling hats that reflected her preference for clean lines and understated elegance. The shop was located on Rue Cambon, an address that would become synonymous with the Chanel brand. As Coco's business began to grow, so did her confidence in her design philosophy. She rejected the ornate styles that dominated women's fashion at the time, instead embracing simplicity and comfort. She drew inspiration from men's clothing, appreciating its functionality and ease of wear. She began to create garments that allowed women to move freely, to be active participants in their own lives, rather than decorative objects constrained by their clothing. The early years of Coco's career coincided with significant social changes. The Belle Epoque was giving way to a new era, one that would be shaped by the First World War and the changing roles of women. Coco seemed to sense this shift before many others, designing clothes that suited the emerging modern woman. Independent, active, and increasingly involved in the world beyond the domestic sphere. Looking back at Gabrielle, Coco Chanel's early life, one can see the threads that would later be woven into the fabric of her extraordinary career. The simplicity and discipline of the Abbey, the practical skills learned at boarding school, the observations made during her time at Royalou. All these experiences shaped her unique vision from a childhood marked by loss and hardship emerged a woman of remarkable resilience and creativity. Someone who would not only succeed in a competitive industry, but would fundamentally change it as the evening light fades and these gentle remembrances of Coco Chanel's early years drift through your mind. Allow yourself to be carried away by the rhythms of her journey from the quiet countryside of Sommer to the elegant streets of Paris. Her path was one of transformation and determination. Let these thoughts settle softly around you like the finest of fabrics as you drift toward peaceful slumber, perhaps dreaming of distant times and the remarkable individuals who shaped our world in ways both seen and unseen. Let us drift further into the story as we explore the next part of this fascinating journey. In the gentle countryside of France, in the latter part of the 19th century, a baby girl was born who would one day transform the world of fashion. Gabrielle Ben-Hur Chanel, known to history as Coco Chanel, came into this world on August 19, 1883, in the small town of Sommer, nestled in the Loire Valley. The landscape around her birthplace was one of rolling vineyards and ancient limestone buildings, a place where time seemed to move with the unhurried pace of the Loire River itself. Coco's family origins were humble and touched with the quiet melancholy that often shapes remarkable lives. Her father, Albert Chanel, was a market stallholder who traveled from town to town, selling work clothes and undergarments at local fairs. He was a man of modest means, but possessed a restless spirit that would later echo in his daughter's refusal to be confined by convention. Albert came from generations of peasant stock, hardworking people who had tilled the French soil for centuries, their lives marked by the turning of seasons and the simple rhythms of rural existence. Coco's mother, Jean de Vallon, brought a different influence to the family tapestry. She was a laundrywoman with a delicate beauty that contrasted with her difficult circumstances. Jean's family had roots in the Auvergne region, a rugged, mountainous area of central France, known for its resilient people and ancient volcanic landscapes. The women in Jean's lineage were known for their skill with needle and thread, passing down techniques of sewing and mending from mother to daughter across generations. The marriage between Albert and Jean was not formalized until much later, and this unconventional beginning would cast a shadow over young Gabrielle's early years. In the late 19th century, such arrangements carried significant social stigma, particularly in the rural communities where traditional values held sway. This early experience of existing somewhat outside society's approval may have planted the seeds for Coco's later willingness to challenge established norms. The Chanel household was one of constant movement and uncertainty. Albert's work required frequent travel, and the family often followed, living a semi-nomadic existence that prevented the establishment of deep community roots. This transient lifestyle meant that young Gabrielle absorbed influences from various regions of France, observing different customs and ways of life that would later inform her cosmopolitan outlook within the family. There were whispered stories of distant ancestors who had shown artistic inclinations. One great-aunt on Jean's side was said to have created intricate lace patterns of such beauty that they caught the attention of a minor aristocrat. Another relative had apparently been a skilled woodworker whose decorative pieces had adorned churches in the Auvergne. These tales, passed down through generations, suggested that creativity flowed in the family bloodline, waiting for the right circumstances to fully express itself. The Chanel home, wherever it temporarily existed, maintained certain traditions despite their unsettled life. Jean insisted on observing the rituals of the Catholic calendar, marking feast days and saints' days with special meals or small gestures. She taught her children simple prayers and the importance of maintaining dignity even in difficult circumstances. From their father, the children learned the value of self-reliance and the art of observing human nature skills that would serve Coco well in her future endeavors. When Gabrielle was just 12 years old, her mother passed away from tuberculosis, a disease that claimed many lives in that era before effective treatments existed. The loss of Jean created a profound rupture in the family structure. Albert, perhaps unable to face the responsibilities of parenthood alone, soon disappeared from his children's lives, leaving them to the care of others. This abandonment represented another layer of displacement in young Gabrielle's developing sense of identity. Following her mother's death, Gabrielle and her sisters were sent to the orphanage of the Cistercian Abbey of Aubazine in the Corrèze department of central France. This austere religious institution would leave an indelible mark on Coco's aesthetic sensibilities. The abbey itself was a study in simplicity. Clean lines, unadorned stone walls, and an emphasis on function over decoration. The nuns wore habits of black and white, with stark geometric patterns that would later echo in Chanel's most iconic designs. Life at Aubazine followed the ancient rhythms of monastic tradition. Days began and ended with prayer, punctuated by periods of work, study, and contemplative silence. In this environment, young Gabrielle learned discipline and developed an appreciation for the beauty of simplicity. The abbey's gardens provided seasonal herbs and flowers, teaching the children about natural cycles and the subtle changes in color and scent throughout the year. During her time at Aubazine, Gabrielle absorbed the cultural heritage of the region. Corrèze was an area rich in folklore and traditional crafts, where older residents still told tales of ancient Celtic beliefs that had blended with Christian practices over centuries. Local women were skilled in techniques of embroidery and textile work that had changed little since medieval times. Though the abbey was somewhat isolated from village life, these influences seeped in through occasional visitors and the backgrounds of the other orphaned children. The nuns at Aubazine recognized Gabrielle's nimble fingers and taught her to sew with precision and care. This practical education would later prove invaluable, though at the time it seemed merely a necessary skill for a girl of her social standing. On Sundays and special feast days, the children would be taken to the Abbey Church, where Gabrielle observed the play of light through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor. An early lesson in the transformative power of light and color. When Gabrielle turned 18, she left Aubazine for a boarding school in the town of Moulins. This transition represented another significant shift in her cultural environment. Moulins was a provincial capital with a rich historical heritage, including a magnificent cathedral and ducal palace that spoke to France's aristocratic past. Here, Gabrielle encountered a wider social spectrum and began to develop the observational skills that would later help her anticipate changes in fashion and society. The boarding school in Moulins continued Gabrielle's education in sewing and needlework, but now with a more worldly emphasis. She learned to create garments that followed the fashions of the day, though she would often question the logic behind the restrictive corsets and elaborate ornamentation that characterized Belle Epoque style. During holidays and free days, she would wander through Moulins, absorbing the architectural details of its medieval buildings and observing how different classes of people presented themselves through clothing and manner. The café culture of early 20th century France was a melting pot of ideas and influences, where artists, intellectuals, and ordinary working people might share the same space, if not the same tables. In these establishments, Gabrielle encountered the changing currents of French society as the old century gave way to the new. The cultural context of Coco's early years was one of significant transition. France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a nation navigating between tradition and modernity. The rural areas where she spent her childhood still maintained customs and ways of life that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Yet the country was also experiencing the effects of industrialization, urbanization, and new political movements that challenged the old order. Within this broader context, Coco's family heritage represented a blend of the enduring peasant culture of France and the emerging working class. Her ancestors had been people who lived close to the land, following seasonal patterns and traditional practices. Yet, her parents' generation was already experiencing the disruptions of a changing economy, forcing them into more precarious forms of employment and less stable living arrangements. The family stories that reached Coco through her mother before her untimely death spoke of simpler times, when communities were more tightly knit and roles more clearly defined. Jean would sometimes tell her children about harvest festivals in her home region, where villagers would gather to celebrate the completion of the year's work with music, dancing, and shared meals that featured local specialties prepared according to recipes handed down through generations. From her father's side came tales of Brittany, where some of his ancestors had originated. These stories featured the distinctive stone cottages of the region, the religious processions that wound through coastal villages, and the superstitions of fishing communities who lived with constant awareness of the sea's dangers. Though Albert was not a man given to sentimentality, these fragments of family history occasionally emerged in quiet moments, connecting his children to a heritage broader than their immediate circumstances. As Coco began to make her way in the world, first in Moulins and later in Paris, she carried these influences with her, not as conscious references, perhaps, but as deeply embedded sensibilities that informed her taste and perspective. The appreciation for quality materials and sound construction that would characterize her designs had roots in the practical wisdom of her peasant ancestors, who understood that true value lay in durability and function rather than superficial ornamentation. The cultural displacement that marked her childhood, moving between regions, between the secular world and religious institution, between different social contexts, gave Coco an unusually broad perspective for someone of her background. She developed the ability to observe social customs with the detached eye of someone who had never fully belonged to any single community. This outsider's viewpoint would later allow her to question conventions that others accepted without thought. As evening shadows lengthen and the pace of the world slows, we might imagine young Gabrielle in those formative years, absorbing the visual vocabulary that would later define her work. The black and white of the nuns' habits at Aubusine, the clean geometric patterns of the abbey's architecture, the subtle natural dyes used in traditional textiles, the practical garments of rural workers that prioritized movement and comfort over display. The journey from that displaced child to the influential designer known as Coco Chanel was not a direct one. There were detours and false starts, relationships that shaped her understanding of different social worlds, and gradual refinements of her aesthetic vision. Yet throughout this evolution, the influences of her family history and cultural roots remained present, transformed but recognizable in her revolutionary approach to fashion and femininity. As you rest now, picture the landscapes that formed the backdrop to Coco's early years. The soft hills of the Loire Valley, the austere beauty of the Cistercian Abbey, the provincial elegance of Moulins, and eventually the sophisticated energy of Paris. In each of these settings, she gathered impressions and insights, building the unique perspective that would allow her to create not just clothing, but a new vision of how women might move through the world. The story of Coco Chanel reminds us that our origins, however humble or complicated, contain gifts that may only reveal their value with time and reflection. As you drift toward sleep, consider how your own family history and cultural roots have shaped your way of seeing and being in the world, creating patterns as distinctive and meaningful as any design that emerged from the house of Chanel. The peaceful narrative of this life continues as we turn our attention to what happened next. In the gentle countryside of France, in the waning years of the 19th century, a little girl named Gabrielle Benhur Chanel came into the world. The year was 1883, and the small town of Sommer in the Loire Valley welcomed this child who would one day transform the world of fashion. But on that day, no one could have imagined the legacy she would create. She was simply another child born to itinerant parents in a modest setting, far from the glamour and sophistication that would later define her life's work. The Loire Valley that surrounded young Gabrielle was a tapestry of natural beauty and historical grandeur. Rolling vineyards stretched across the landscape, their neat rows of vines creating patterns against the earth. The Loire River itself meandered through the countryside, its waters reflecting the changing moods of the sky. In the mornings, a delicate mist often hovered above the river, softening the contours of the land and lending an ethereal quality to the scene. As the sun rose higher, it would burn away this gentle veil, revealing the lush greenery and the distant silhouettes of ancient shattucks that dotted the horizon. These shattucks, with their elegant spires and weathered stone walls, stood as reminders of France's aristocratic past. They represented a world of privilege and refinement that would have seemed impossibly distant to the Chanel family. Gabrielle's father, Albert Chanel, was a market trader who traveled from town to town selling his wares. Her mother, Jean Duvalel, was a laundrywoman whose hands were roughened by constant work with soap and water. Their home was not a chateau, but a simple dwelling, often temporary as they moved in search of better opportunities. The sounds that filled Gabrielle's early world were not those of refined conversation or classical music, but the everyday symphony of rural and small-town life. There was the gentle clatter of her mother's work, the splash of water, the scrubbing of fabric against washboards, the snap of sheets being shaken out to dry in the breeze. There were the calls of market vendors, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestone streets, the distant church bells marking the hours of the day, and perhaps most significantly for the young girl, there was the rhythmic click of her father's boots as he departed for long periods, leaving the family behind. The textures of Gabrielle's childhood were equally humble, but rich with sensory detail. The rough homespun fabrics of her clothing, so different from the luxurious materials she would later favor. The smooth coolness of river stones collected during rare moments of play, the warmth of shared beds in cramped rooms where she slept alongside her siblings, the varied surfaces of the different towns and villages where they temporarily settled, here a dusty path, there a cobbled square, elsewhere the worn wooden floors of rented rooms. When Gabrielle was just 12 years old, her mother passed away from tuberculosis, a common and devastating illness in that era. The loss transformed her world completely. The already precarious family structure dissolved further when her father, unable or unwilling to care for his children, sent Gabrielle and her sisters to the orphanage at the Cistercian Abbey of Aubazine. The abbey presented a stark contrast to the varied, if humble, environments of her earlier childhood. Here, high stone walls enclosed a world of strict routine and austere beauty. The building itself was a study in geometric precision and spiritual purpose. Tall windows allowed shafts of light to penetrate the cool interior, creating patterns on the stone floors that shifted with the passing hours. These patterns of light and shadow would later find echoes in Chanel's design aesthetic, with its emphasis on clean lines and the interplay of darkness and illumination. The daily rhythm at Aubazine was marked by the tolling of bells, calling the residents to prayer, meals, work, and rest. The sound would reverberate through the stone corridors, felt as much as heard. There was the shuffle of feet as the orphans moved in ordered lines, the murmur of prayers, the occasional stern instruction from the nuns who oversaw their care. Silence was often required, teaching young Gabrielle an appreciation for quietude that would influence her later preference for understated elegance over noisy ostentation. The landscape surrounding the abbey offered its own form of austere beauty. The Cistercian order had chosen this location for its isolation, and the natural environment reflected this remove from worldly concerns. There were forests of oak and chestnut, their leaves creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns. There were meadows where wildflowers bloomed in spring, their colors a contrast to the monochrome palette of the abbey itself. There were distant hills that changed appearance with the seasons, verdant in summer, golden in autumn, stark and beautiful in winter, when snow occasionally dusted their slopes. Within the abbey, the spaces were designed for functionality rather than comfort. The dormitories where Gabrielle slept alongside other orphaned girls were spare, with narrow beds arranged in neat rows. The refectory where they took their meals featured long wooden tables worn smooth by generations of use. The chapel, the heart of abbey life, combined spiritual elevation with architectural discipline, its high ceilings drawing the eye upward, while its straight lines emphasized order and control. The gardens of the abbey served both practical and contemplative purposes. There were kitchen gardens where vegetables and herbs grew in carefully tended beds, providing food for the community. There were also more formal gardens designed for walking meditation, with gravel paths that crunched softly underfoot and occasionally opened into small clearings where stone benches offered places for rest and reflection. The sensory experience of Aubazine was defined by contrasts. The cool touch of stone walls against the occasional warmth of sunlight through windows, the silence of contemplation broken by the resonant tones of bells, the plain fare of daily meals occasionally complemented by the sweetness of fruit from the abbey orchards. These contrasts taught young Gabrielle an appreciation for the power of juxtaposition, for the way meaning and beauty can emerge from the relationship between opposites. The clothing worn by the orphans at Aubazine was simple and utilitarian. Plain dresses in subdued colors, often black or white, with clean lines and minimal ornamentation. This aesthetic of simplicity would later become a hallmark of Chanel's revolutionary approach to fashion. The nuns themselves wore habits that demonstrated how a uniform could convey dignity and purpose. Another concept that would find expression in Chanel's later work. When Gabrielle left the abbey at 18, she carried with her these formative influences: the geometric patterns of light and stone, the discipline of routine, the beauty of austerity, and the power of contrast. Her next environment would be the provincial town of Moulins, where she found work as a seamstress and occasionally performed as a singer in cafes, earning her the nickname Coco that would stay with her throughout her life. Moulins offered a different kind of sensory landscape. Here was a small but vibrant town with its own rhythms and textures. The central square with its fountain that burbled continuously, creating a background soundtrack to daily life. The shop windows displaying goods that, while modest by Parisian standards, represented luxury to someone raised in an orphanage. The cafe concerts where Coco performed, with their tobacco-scented air, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation punctuated by laughter, and the upright pianos whose keys had been yellowed by years of use. The buildings of Moulins were predominantly provincial French in style, solid structures of stone or plaster with shuttered windows and tiled roofs. They lined streets that might be narrow and winding or broader avenues planted with trees that provided welcome shade in summer. The town had its hierarchy of neighborhoods, from the more prosperous center to the humbler outskirts, and Coco's position as a working woman meant she inhabited the spaces between neither the luxury of the wealthy nor the deprivation of the truly poor. The natural environment around Moulins was less dramatic than the Loire Valley or the isolated setting of Aubazine, but it had its own quiet charm. The Allier River flowed past the town, offering places for Sunday walks. There were public gardens where townspeople could promenade, seeing and being seen in a ritual of community that was as much about social connection as enjoyment of nature. Beyond the town lay the gentle countryside of the Bourbonnais region, with its patchwork of fields and small woodlands. It was in Moulins that Coco began to move in more varied social circles, particularly after she became the mistress of Etienne Balsan, a wealthy military officer and heir to a textile fortune. Through this relationship, she gained entry to a world of greater privilege, spending time at Balsan's estate, Royalou, Here, the environment was one of casual luxury, a country house with comfortable furnishings, expansive grounds where horses grazed in paddocks, and a social life that revolved around riding, hunting, and leisurely meals. The sensory experience of Royalou would have been markedly different from anything in Coco's previous life. There was the soft give of upholstered furniture, the warmth of fires in marble fireplaces, the gleam of polished silver and crystal on dining tables. There were the smells of good food being prepared, of leather tack in the stables, of expensive perfumes worn by female guests. There were the sounds of sociability, animated conversation, music from the gramophone, the pop of champagne corks, and laughter that spoke of ease and confidence rather than the nervous release of tension. Through Balsan, Coco met Arthur Boy Capel, who would become both her lover and her business backer. With Capel's support, she opened her first shop in Paris in 1910, selling hats. Paris represented yet another environmental transformation in Coco's life. A city of grand boulevards and intimate alleyways, of monumental architecture and hidden courtyards, of refined cultural institutions and bohemian cafes. The Paris of the early 20th century was a city in transition, balancing its historic character with modern innovations. There were horse-drawn carriages alongside early automobiles, gas lamps being gradually replaced by electric lighting, traditional craftsmanship existing alongside new manufacturing techniques. This blend of tradition and innovation would come to characterize Chanel's approach to design, respecting the past while boldly embracing the future. The sensory landscape of Paris was rich and varied. There was the particular quality of light that has attracted artists for centuries. Clear yet soft, capable of illuminating the cream-colored stone buildings in a way that makes them appear to glow from within. There were the distinctive sounds, the calls of street vendors, the clatter of dishes and conversation spilling from cafes, the bells of churches marking the hours, the clip of heels on pavements. There were the smells, fresh bread from the boulangeries, coffee, cigarette smoke, perfume, and occasionally the less pleasant odors of a densely populated city still developing its modern sanitation systems. As Coco established her business and her reputation grew, her personal environment reflected her evolving aesthetic. Her apartment above her shop on Rue Cambon became a laboratory for her design philosophy, a space where comfort met elegance, where traditional elements were reimagined in modern ways. The famous mirrored staircase allowed her to observe fashion shows without being seen, creating a distance that preserved her mystique, while giving her a comprehensive view of how her creations moved and were received throughout all these environmental transitions, from the rural simplicity of her earliest years, through the geometric austerity of Aubusine, the provincial charm of Moulins, the casual luxury of Royalou, to the sophisticated energy of Paris. Coco Chanel absorbed influences that would shape her revolutionary vision. She learned to value simplicity, to appreciate the beauty of functional design, to understand how environments shape behavior and identity, and to recognize that true elegance lies not in ornate display, but in the harmony of form and purpose. As you relax deeper, let us now softly explore the next chapter of this soothing biography. The early education of Gabrielle, Coco Chanel, unfolded not in prestigious academies or formal institutions, but rather in the gentle rhythm of life's natural classroom. After her mother's passing, when she was merely 12 years old, young Gabrielle found herself at the convent of Aubizine, where the nuns took her under their protective wings like soft feathers, sheltering a delicate bird. The convent's austere stone corridors and simple geometric patterns would later whisper through her designs, calling back to these formative days spent in quiet contemplation. In the gentle quiet of Aubizine, Gabrielle's days flowed with unhurried regularity. She would wake with the soft morning light filtering through narrow windows, the stone floors cool beneath her feet as she moved through her morning rituals. The nuns taught her to sew with patient hands, guiding her fingers as they created small, even stitches across clean white fabric. They showed her how to hold the needle just so, how to feel the tension of the thread, how to bring order and beauty to raw materials. These peaceful hours spent in the workroom, with motes of dust dancing in sunbeams, planted the seeds of her future artistry. The education she received was practical rather than academic, focused on creating useful objects with care and precision. There were no lectures on fashion history, no studies of great designers who had come before. Instead, there was the quiet discipline of daily work, the satisfaction of completing a task well, and the understanding that simplicity often holds more beauty than elaborate decoration. The nuns, in their plain black and white habits, unknowingly provided her first lesson in the power of a stark, contrasting palette, a lesson she would carry with her throughout her creative life. When Gabrielle left the convent at 18, she carried with her not diplomas or certificates, but something far more valuable: a trained eye for clean lines, a steady hand with a needle, and an appreciation for the dignity of unadorned spaces. These gentle gifts would serve as the foundation upon which she would build her empire. Her next phase of learning came in the small town of Moulins, where she found work as a seamstress. The shop where she spent her days was filled with the soft sounds of women's voices, the whisper of fabric being unfurled across cutting tables, the gentle snip of scissors. Here, in this humble setting, Gabrielle observed the women who came for fittings, ladies of means, who wore complicated garments that restricted their movements and required assistance to put on and take off. As her nimble fingers worked, her mind drifted like a leaf on a stream, wondering why women's clothing needed to be so constricting, so dependent on corsets and multiple layers. She would watch these women struggle to sit comfortably, to breathe deeply, to move with natural grace. And in the quiet of her thoughts, she began to imagine alternatives, simpler garments that would allow freedom of movement, that a woman could don herself, that would enhance rather than disguise the natural form. During evenings at a local cafe concert called La Rotonde, Gabrielle would sometimes sing for small audiences. The patrons began calling her Coco, a name as simple and memorable as the designs she would later create. In these evening performances, she studied the room with observant eyes, noting how women dressed, how they moved, what seemed to bring them comfort or discomfort. Each observation was like a soft rain nourishing the garden of her developing aesthetic. It was during this period that Coco met Etienne Balsan, a wealthy military officer and heir to a textile fortune. Their connection would lead her to his estate at Royalou, where her education would take yet another turn. Royalou offered Coco a window into a world of privilege and leisure. Here, among the gentle rustle of trees and the soft nickering of horses, she observed the casual elegance of men's sporting clothes, their simple lines, their functionality, their comfort. Why, she wondered in the quiet of her mind, couldn't women enjoy such practical elegance? The riding habits worn by women at Royalou were particularly cumbersome. Long skirts that could be dangerous when riding, elaborate hats that needed constant adjustment, tight bodices that restricted breathing. Coco began to adapt men's riding clothes for her own use, creating simpler, more practical garments that allowed her to ride astride rather than side saddle. The other women noticed her innovations, her comfort, her freedom of movement, and soon they were asking her to create similar garments for them. This informal education in design continued when Coco met Arthur Boy Capel, an English businessman and polo player who would become the great love of her life. Capel recognized something special in Coco's emerging design sensibility, a fresh perspective that challenged conventional ideas about women's fashion. He saw not just her talent, but her vision. And in 1910, he helped her establish her first shop in Paris, selling hats at 21 Rue Cambon. The hat shop became a quiet laboratory where Coco could experiment with her ideas. She created simple, elegant designs that contrasted sharply with the elaborate, heavily decorated hats that were fashionable at the time. Her creations were like a cool, refreshing breeze in a stuffy room. Clean lines, minimal ornamentation, designed to frame a woman's face rather than overwhelm it. As her business slowly expanded from hats to clothing, Coco continued her self-education by observing, questioning, and experimenting. She spent hours in the Louvre, absorbing the harmonious proportions of classical art, the balance of negative and positive space, the way light played across surfaces. She wandered through Paris streets, watching how women moved, what impeded them, what they seemed to need. Each observation was like a small pebble added to a cairn, gradually building the monument of her design philosophy. During World War I, Coco's education deepened through necessity and observation. With men away at war, women took on new roles and needed clothing that allowed them to work, to move, to live independently. The war created shortages of materials, which led Coco to experiment with fabrics not traditionally used in women's fashion. Jersey, previously used primarily for men's underwear, became a signature material in her designs. Soft, comfortable, draping beautifully around the body without constriction. The war years also brought a shift in society's mood. The elaborate, ornate Belle Epoque style seemed inappropriate, even disrespectful, during a time of such suffering and loss. Coco's simpler aesthetic resonated with this cultural shift, offering a quiet elegance that felt right for the moment. Her designs spoke of resilience, of practicality, of moving forward rather than clinging to the past. In the 1920s, as her business flourished like a garden in spring sunshine, Coco's self-education expanded to include the worlds of art and literature. She formed friendships with artists like Pablo Picasso and Jean Cocteau, writers like Pierre Reverdy and Max Jacob. These relationships were not formal mentorships, but rather gentle exchanges of ideas, conversations that flowed like water over stones, smoothing and shaping her thinking. From the Cubists, she absorbed ideas about breaking down forms to their essential elements, about seeing objects from multiple perspectives simultaneously. From the Surrealists, she learned about the power of unexpected juxtapositions, about finding beauty in the unconventional. From the Russian ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev and his ballets Russes, she gained an appreciation for movement, for how fabric behaves on a body in motion, for the drama of color and texture. Throughout this period of intellectual flowering, Coco maintained her practice of careful observation and questioning. Why did women need to change clothes multiple times a day? Why couldn't they have pockets like men did? Why should comfort be sacrificed for appearance? Why couldn't beauty and functionality coexist in harmony? Her answers to these questions emerged in innovations that would change women's fashion forever. The little black dress, the Chanel suit with its boxy jacket and comfortable skirt, costume jewelry that made adornment accessible, the quilted handbag with its chain strap that freed a woman's hands. Each creation was a response to a need she had observed, a solution to a problem she had identified through her careful study of women's lives. Perhaps one of the most significant aspects of Coco's self-education was her development of a philosophy about the relationship between clothing and identity. She understood, with a depth that came from her own experience of reinvention, that what we wear shapes how we feel, how we move through the world, how others perceive us. Dress shabbily and they remember the dress. Dress impeccably and they remember the woman, she once said, her words flowing with the wisdom of someone who had studied deeply the the psychology of appearance. As the years passed like pages turning in a book, Coco continued to learn, to observe, to refine her vision, even in her later years. When her business had become a global empire, she maintained the habits of a student, questioning, experimenting, revising. Her education never ended because she never stopped being curious about the world around her, about the needs and desires of women, about the possibilities of fabric and form. The legacy of Coco Chanel's self-directed education lives on in every woman who slips on a little black dress, who carries a quilted handbag, who appreciates the freedom of movement that comes from well-designed clothing. Her journey from orphaned child to fashion revolutionary reminds us that the most profound learning often happens outside classroom walls, in the quiet spaces of observation and reflection, in the gentle rhythm of questions asked and answered through creation. As we drift toward sleep, we might imagine Coco in her apartment above the Rue Cambon shop, sitting quietly at her desk as evening settles over Paris. Perhaps she is sketching a new design. Perhaps she is simply thinking, watching the play of shadow and light across the wall as the day softly ends. In this moment of stillness, all the threads of her education, the convent's geometry, the practical skills of the seamstress, the observations of women's needs, the conversations with artists and writers, come together in perfect harmony, like notes in a lullaby, gentle and true. Our soothing biography continues with a look at the next important period in this incredible life. In the quiet hush of evening, as the last light fades over Paris, we might imagine Coco Chanel reflecting on the many people who shaped her journey, each one leaving an indelible mark on her mind and heart, like the delicate layers of a finely crafted garment. These relationships unfolded over time, teaching her, challenging her, and guiding her toward the woman she would become. The first threads of influence were woven in the austere halls of the Aubusine convent, where young Gabrielle, not yet called Coco, found herself after her mother's death. The nuns, strict yet not unkind, instilled in her a sense of discipline, of order, of quiet craftsmanship. They taught her to sew with precision, to appreciate the clean lines of their habits, the stark beauty of simplicity. The convent's architecture itself, with its perfect symmetry and unadorned elegance, would later echo in her designs, those straight, unfussy lines that would liberate women from the constraints of corsets and frills. In the silence of those stone corridors, she learned patience, the slow mastery of skill, the understanding that beauty need not shout to be heard. Years later, when she took her first tentative steps into the world beyond the orphanage, she found another mentor in her Aunt Adrienne, who introduced her to the art of millinery. Together, they stitched hats in a small shop, Adrienne's hands guiding hers, teaching her the subtle art of shaping fabric, of balancing proportion. It was here that Coco first understood that fashion was not just about covering the body, but about framing it, enhancing it, giving it expression. Adrienne's quiet confidence, her refusal to conform to the exaggerated styles of the time, planted the seed of rebellion in Coco's mind. The idea that women's clothing could be both beautiful and practical. Then came Etienne Balsan, the wealthy playboy who swept her into a world of racehorses and high society. Though not a mentor in the traditional sense, he exposed her to a life she had never known, one of luxury, leisure, and the unspoken rules of the upper class. From him, she learned how the elite dressed, how they carried themselves, what they valued. But more importantly, she learned what they lacked: the freedom to move, to breathe, to be themselves beneath the weight of stiff collars and heavy skirts. It was in Balsan's stables, watching the effortless grace of riders in their fitted jackets, that she first envisioned a new kind of elegance, one that borrowed from menswear, one that allowed women to stride, not mince, through the world. Her next great influence was Boy Capel, the English businessman who became her lover, and in many ways, her intellectual equal. Unlike Balsan, Boy did not merely provide her with an entree into society. He challenged her, debated with her, treated her as a partner rather than an ornament. He introduced her to literature, to philosophy, to the idea that clothing could be more than decoration. It could be a statement, a rebellion, an art form. It was Boy who lent her the money to open her first shop in Paris, who believed in her vision when others dismissed her as just another seamstress. And when he died tragically young, it was his memory that lingered in the black dresses she designed, a color once reserved for mourning, transformed into a symbol of timeless sophistication. The artistic circles of Paris brought still more mentors into her life. Messiah Sert, the queen of avant-garde society, became both friend and muse, introducing her to painters like Picasso and composers like Stravinsky. Messiah's bohemian spirit, her refusal to be bound by convention, emboldened Coco to push her designs further, to blur the lines between fashion and art. In the dim glow of Messiah's salons, amid the smoke and laughter of artists and writers, Coco absorbed the energy of modernism, the belief that tradition could be honored even as it was reinvented. And then there were the women themselves, the clients, the socialites, the actresses who wore her clothes, and in doing so, taught her what women truly wanted. The Duchess of Westminster, with her understated glamour, showed her that true elegance lay in restraint. The dancer Josephine Baker, with her fearless sensuality, proved that fashion could be playful, daring, alive. Each woman who stepped into her atelier became a lesson in movement, in personality, in the subtle ways clothing could empower or confine. Even in her later years, long after she had become a legend, Coco remained a student of the world. The Russian immigré Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich introduced her to the opulence of Slavic embroidery, which she translated into the intricate detailing of her costumes, the young designer Christian Dior, though her rival, made her reconsider her own principles, forcing her to refine her vision in response to his new look. And the writers who frequented the Ritz, from Colette to Cocteau, kept her mind sharp, her wit honed, her curiosity forever alight. As the years passed, these mentors and muses faded like old photographs, their voices blending into the quiet hum of memory. Yet their lessons remained, stitched into the very fabric of her work. The nun's discipline, Adrienne's craftsmanship, Boy's intellectual rigor, Messiah's boldness, all of them lived on in every sleeve she shortened, every hem she raised, every woman she dressed. Corsets, with their whalebone and laces, were impractical for a nurse bending over a hospital bed or a factory worker tending to machinery. Coco, ever observant, saw the moment for what it was, a chance to redefine femininity. She began working with jersey, a fabric previously reserved for men's undergarments, because it draped softly, followed the body rather than constricting it. The critics scoffed. How could something so plain, so unstructured, be fashionable? But the women who wore her designs understood. For the first time, they could breathe. By 1915, she had expanded beyond hats, opening a boutique in Deauville where she sold simple, elegant separates, sweaters, skirts, and the first inklings of the sailor-inspired pieces that would become her signature. The war raged on, but in the seaside town, the wealthy still sought refuge, and Coco was there to dress them. She worked tirelessly, her fingers nimble, her mind racing ahead of the trends. When fabric shortages made materials scarce, she improvised, turning men's sweaters into women's cardigans, repurposing military surplus into chic, utilitarian jackets. Necessity, she learned, was the mother of invention. The end of the war brought a new world, one eager to shed the weight of the past. The roaring 20s dawned, and with them, a hunger for freedom, for movement, for life. Coco was ready. She shortened skirts, bared ankles, and liberated waists from corsets. She introduced the little black dress, a radical notion in an era when black was reserved for mourning. But in her hands, it became a symbol of sophistication, a blank canvas that any woman could make her own. Her atelier buzzed with activity, a hive of seamstresses and embroiderers, translating her vision into reality. She demanded perfection, her standards exacting. But those who worked with her knew it came from a place of deep respect for the craft. She had never forgotten the nun's lessons, the way a single crooked stitch could unravel the whole, and through it all, there were the people who shaped her. Capel, whose belief in her never wavered, even as their love story unraveled. Messiah Sert, the Polish artist who became her closest friend and fiercest critic, the Russian émigrés who brought her the opulence of their lost world, the gold embroidery and fur trimmings that would find new life in her designs. Each left their mark, a thread woven into the tapestry of her work. By the time the decade turned, Chanel was no longer just a name, it was an idea, a revolution stitched into every seam. And yet, in those quiet moments before sleep, perhaps she still thought of the girl from Moulins, the one who dared to imagine that fashion could be more than ornament, that it could be freedom itself. And as we drift into dreams, we might imagine her too, fingers tracing the edge of a sleeve, still listening for the whispers of those who taught her, still learning, always learning, as the world softly turns around her, drifting like clouds across the evening sky. We now move to the next part of this calming life story. The years that followed saw Coco Chanel rise not just as a designer, but as a force that reshaped the very fabric of women's fashion. Her work was born from a quiet rebellion, a desire to free women from the stiff corsets and heavy layers that had confined them for centuries. She looked at the world with clear, unflinching eyes, seeing not what was, but what could be. And in that vision, she found simplicity, movement, elegance. It began with jersey fabric, an unusual choice at the time, reserved mostly for men's undergarments. But Chanel saw something in its soft drape, the way it moved with the body rather than against it. She transformed it into dresses that flowed like water, skirts that swayed with each step, blouses that breathed. Women who wore her designs felt lighter, unburdened, as if they had shed not just fabric, but an entire era of constraint. Her little black dress, unveiled in 1926, was perhaps her most enduring gift to fashion. At a time when black was reserved for mourning, she made it chic, sophisticated, universal. Vogue called it the frock that all the world will wear, and they were right. It was a blank canvas, adaptable to any occasion, any woman elegant in its simplicity, powerful in its restraint. She had taken something ordinary and made it extraordinary, a quiet revolution in a single seam. Then there were the suits, those perfectly tailored jackets with their slim lines and boxy silhouettes, paired with slender skirts that whispered rather than rustled, inspired by menswear, but softened for the female form. They became a uniform for the modern woman, structured yet effortless, professional yet undeniably feminine. Each jacket was lined with a delicate silk, a secret luxury only the wearer would know, a reminder that beauty could be both seen and felt. Her accessories, too, carried her signature touch. The quilted handbag, with its chain strap inspired by the caretaker's keys at the orphanage where she grew up, was both practical and poetic. The two-tone slingback pumps, beige elongating the leg and black grounding the foot, were designed for movement, for life. Even her costume jewelry, ropes of pearls, cascades of gold chains, was meant to be worn without pretense, as if it had always belonged to the woman who adorned herself with it. Chanel's process was methodical, unhurried. She worked with her hands, draping fabric directly on the body, pinning and repinning until the lines were just right. She believed in the alchemy of cut and cloth, in the way A single millimeter could change everything. Her atelier was a sanctuary of precision, where seams were stitched and restitched until they disappeared into perfection. She had no patience for excess, for anything that did not serve a purpose. Her inspirations were as varied as her designs. She borrowed from the sailor stripes of the French Navy, the clean lines of monastic robes, even the utilitarian simplicity of workers' uniforms. She loved the contrast of masculine and feminine, the tension between strength and softness. And always, there was her childhood in Aubusine, the austere beauty of the nuns' habits, the stark black and white of the chapel floors, echoes of which would appear in her collections again and again. The impact of her work was profound, rippling far beyond the walls of her Rue Cambon salon. She didn't just change how women dressed, she changed how they moved through the world. Her designs were for women who lived, who worked, who dared women who no longer wanted to be decorative objects, but active participants in their own lives. In freeing the body, she had also freed the spirit, and yet, for all her innovation, there was a timelessness to her creations. A Chanel jacket from the 1920s could be worn today and still feel modern, still carry that same quiet authority. That was her genius, the ability to distill fashion to its essence, to strip away the unnecessary and leave only what mattered. As the years passed, her influence only deepened. Perfume became another canvas for her artistry, and in 1921, she created Chanel No. 5, a scent as revolutionary as her clothes. It was the first to bear a designer's name, the first to mix floral and aldehydic notes into something wholly new. Like her little black dress, it was designed to be universal, to become part of the woman who wore it. A woman should wear perfume wherever she expects to be kissed, she said. And with that, she transformed fragrance from an accessory into an intimate signature. Even her personal style became part of her legacy. The tan, the boyish crop, the piles of jewelry worn with nonchalance. She was her own best model, living proof that elegance was not about trends, but about attitude. Through wars and revolutions, through shifting tides of fashion, Chanel endured. She closed her house during World War II, only to return in 1954, at the age of 71, with a collection that silenced critics and reasserted her dominance. The world had changed, but her vision had not. She still believed in clean lines, in comfort, in the power of understatement. And once again, women listened. In the quiet of her apartment above the boutique, surrounded by coromandel screens and crystal chandeliers, she remained a woman of contradictions, both bold and reserved, fiercely independent, yet shaped by the loves and losses of her life. She never married, never bowed to convention, yet her work was deeply personal, woven with memories of Capel, of Messiah, of the nuns who taught her to sew. And so, as we think of her now, we might picture her in that timeless suit, a strand of pearls at her neck, standing before a mirror, adjusting a cuff, smoothing a lapel, still perfecting, still refining, still searching for that elusive balance between simplicity and splendor. Her legacy is not just in the clothes or the perfumes, but in the very idea she championed that fashion should serve the woman, not the other way around. And as sleep draws near, we can almost hear the whisper of fabric, the snip of scissors, the quiet hum of an atelier where creation never ends. The world she helped shape still carries her imprint, still moves to the rhythm she set in motion so long ago. And in that thought, there is a kind of lullaby, a gentle reminder that beauty, true beauty, is both fleeting and eternal, just like the softest breath before dreams take hold. As your breathing becomes more regular, let us continue with the next chapter of our biography. Imagine, if you will, a young girl in the dim corridors of an orphanage in Abyssine, her fingers tracing the clean, straight lines of the nuns' habits, the stark simplicity of their black and white robes. The austerity of that place could have broken a lesser spirit. But for Gabrielle Chanel, it planted the seeds of something extraordinary. In those quiet, disciplined halls, she learned to sew, stitch by careful stitch, her hands moving with a precision that would one day redefine elegance itself. Had she turned away from that craft, had she let the hardship of her childhood harden her instead of inspire her, the world might never have known the sharp, clean lines of the little black dress or the effortless drape of a Chanel suit. But she did not turn away. Instead, she carried those lessons with her, like a secret tucked into the hem of a garment, waiting to be revealed. Years later, in the soft glow of a cafe concert, she stood on a small stage, singing playful tunes to a modest crowd. They called her Coco, a name that clung to her like perfume. It was here that she caught the eye of Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir who would become her first patron, offering her a glimpse into a world of luxury and excess. She could have remained in his shadow, a kept woman draped in borrowed finery, content with the comforts he provided. But Coco was never one to be content with borrowed things. She saw the way women moved in their corsets, constrained and uncomfortable, and she dreamed of something different, something free. When she left Balsan's world to open her first millinery shop in Paris, it was not just a career choice, it was a declaration of independence. Had she stayed, she might have faded into obscurity, another pretty face in the background of a rich man's life. Instead, she stepped into the light, scissors in hand, ready to cut away the excess of the past. Then came Boy Capel, the love of her life, the man who believed in her vision enough to finance her first boutique on Rue Cambon. His support was more than financial. It was emotional, intellectual. He saw her not just as a mistress or a seamstress, but as an artist. Their love affair was passionate, tumultuous, and tragically brief. When he died in a car accident, the loss could have shattered her. Grief has a way of silencing even the strongest voices. But Coco did something remarkable. She channeled that pain into her work. The little black dress, that icon of understated elegance, was born from mourning. Had she let sorrow consume her? Had she closed her atelier and retreated from the world? Fashion might have remained anchored in the frills and fuss of the past. Instead, she gave women a new way to dress, one that honored both simplicity and depth. The 1920s brought another turning point. The creation of Chanel No. 5 perfume was, at the time, a domain dominated by florals, heavy and sweet. But Coco wanted something different, a scent as modern as her designs, something that would linger like a whisper rather than shout. She collaborated with a perfumer, Ernest Beau, and together they crafted a fragrance that was fresh, complex, utterly unlike anything else. It was a risk. Perfume was not her world. She was a couturier, not a perfumer. Had she hesitated, had she stuck to what she knew, the iconic bottle with its clean lines and golden label might never have graced vanities around the world. But she took the leap, and in doing so, she changed the landscape of beauty forever. The war years tested her in ways she could never have anticipated. Her affair with a German officer during the occupation of Paris cast a long shadow over her legacy, forcing her into exile in Switzerland. The world moved on without her, and when she returned to Paris in the 1950s, her relevance was questioned. The House of Dior had risen, championing the new look with its cinched waists and voluminous skirts, a far cry from Chanel's sleek silhouettes. Many would have accepted defeat, retreated into retirement. But Coco, now in her 70s, did the unthinkable. She staged a comeback. She reopened her atelier, presenting a collection that critics initially dismissed. Yet slowly, women returned to her. They remembered the ease of her designs, the way her clothes made them feel unburdened, confident themselves. Had she stayed in Switzerland, had she let the critics' words silence her, the Chanel suit might have remained a relic of the past. Instead, she reclaimed her place, proving that elegance is timeless. And so, as we trace the arc of her life, we see how each crossroads, each decision, shaped not just her destiny, but the very fabric of fashion. What if she had never left the orphanage? What if she had remained a singer, a muse, a mistress? What if grief had stifled her creativity instead of fueling it? The world would be a different place, less refined, less daring, less free. She moved forward, always forward, leaving behind a legacy stitched with courage, innovation, and an unshakable belief in her own vision. Now, as sleep begins to settle over you, imagine her in her later years, standing in that mirrored apartment, surrounded by the treasures of her life, the coromandel screens, the crystal chandeliers, the stacks of books, all reflections of a woman who refused to be defined by any one thing. She was a seamstress, a perfumer, a rebel, a legend. And as you drift into dreams, perhaps you can almost hear the faint sound of scissors snipping, the rustle of fabric, the quiet hum of a woman who changed the world one stitch at a time. The calming story continues as we gently examine what happened next in this remarkable journey. The relationships in Coco Chanel's life were like threads in one of her own exquisite fabrics, some strong and enduring, others delicate and fleeting, but all woven together to create the tapestry of her extraordinary existence, from the lonely days of her childhood to the glittering heights of her career. The people she loved, lost, and collaborated with shaped her in ways both subtle and profound. Her earliest bonds were fragile, marked by abandonment, the death of her mother, and her father's decision to leave her at the Aubazine orphanage could have hardened her heart forever. But instead, the sisters there, with their quiet discipline and austere habits, taught her the value of precision, of clean lines, lessons she would later translate into her designs. The simplicity of the nuns' black and white robes would echo in her iconic little black dress, in the crisp contrast of her suits. Even in those cold, stone corridors, she learned to sew, her small fingers moving with a patience beyond her years. Then came the years of singing in cabarets, where she earned the nickname Coco, a playful moniker that stuck for life. It was there she met Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir who would become her first great love and patron. He introduced her to a world of luxury, of racehorses and champagne, of silk and pearls. In his shadowhouse, she mingled with aristocrats and artists, absorbing the confidence of the elite, while quietly noting the impracticality of their corseted gowns. Balsan adored her, but theirs was an uneven love. He saw her as a charming companion, while she longed for independence. When she left him for his friend, the dashing Englishman Arthur Boy Capel, it was not just a romantic shift, but a declaration of her own will. Capel was different. He saw her not as an accessory, but as an equal, a woman of fierce intelligence and ambition. He financed her first boutique in Paris, believing in her vision when few others did. Their love was passionate, tender, and tragically brief. His death in a car accident shattered her. She dressed in black for years, turning grief into something elegant, transforming mourning into a statement. The little black dress, born from sorrow, would become a symbol of timeless sophistication. In the years that followed, her heart remained guarded, but her friendships deepened. Messiah Sert, a Polish pianist and muse to artists like Renoir and Toulouse-Lautrec, became her closest confidant. Messiah was bold, bohemian, unafraid of scandal qualities Coco admired. They shared a love of art, of beauty, of living on their own terms. Through Messiah, Coco entered the world of the Russian ballet, meeting Sergei Diaghilev and Igor Stravinsky. These collaborations were electric, blending fashion with avant-garde performance. She designed costumes for the ballet, her fabrics moving with the dancers, her seams holding their own against the drama of the stage. Yet not all relationships were so harmonious. The poet Pierre Reverdy, with his brooding intensity, drew her into a turbulent affair. He was married, tormented by his own demons, and their love was as much about intellectual sparring as romance. They wrote letters filled with longing and frustration, their connection as much in the mind as the heart. When it ended, she kept his letters close, a private archive of a love that was never meant to last. Then came the war, and with it, the most controversial relationship of her life. Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a German officer. In occupied Paris, their affair was not just a personal entanglement, but a political liability. Some whispered she had collaborated, others saw it as survival. When the war ended, the scandal forced her into exile in Switzerland, a lonely interlude where she watched from afar as fashion moved on without her. The bonds she had built over decades frayed in her absence. Old friends distanced themselves. New designers like Dior claimed the spotlight. But Coco was not one to fade away. In her 70s, she returned to Paris, determined to reclaim her place. The critics scoffed, but a few loyal allies stood by her. Her longtime seamstresses, women who had worked with her for years, returned to the atelier, their skilled hands remembering the exact way she liked a dart to lie, a sleeve to fall. And then there was Claude Delay, the young journalist who became her unofficial biographer, listening for hours as Coco recounted her life with a mix of pride and melancholy. Their conversations were like stitches, repairing the fabric of her legacy. Even in her final years, her relationships remained as complex as ever. She was imperious with employees, demanding perfection. Yet, she could be unexpectedly tender with those she trusted. She adopted a nephew, André Palace, bringing him into her world, though she never fully softened into maternal warmth. And then there were the women who wore her clothes, actresses like Audrey Hepburn and Jean Morrow, socialites and shopgirls alike, who found in her designs a kind of freedom. They didn't just wear Chanel, they became Chanel, carrying her vision forward long after she was gone. As you drift toward sleep, imagine her in that lavish apartment at the Ritz, surrounded by the artifacts of a life richly lived. The gold leaf mirrors reflect not just her face, but the faces of all those who loved her, challenged her, left her, or stayed. The scent of number 5 lingers in the air, a fragrance born from a love letter of ingredients given to her by a perfumer who understood her desire for something unforgettable. And perhaps, in these quiet moments before dreams take hold, you can sense the echoes of her laughter with Messiah, the whispered debates with Reverdy, the silent grief for Capel. Each relationship was a stitch in the fabric of her life, some tight and secure, others loosened by time, but all essential. For Coco Chanel, love was never simple, but it was always part of the design. Now let your breath slow, your thoughts soften, as the weight of these stories settles over you like one of her finely tailored jackets. The hum of the past fades into the hush of night, and you can almost see her, standing at the window of her atelier, watching the lights of Paris. A woman who was never alone, even in her solitude. Good night. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort as we explore the next phase of this soothing biography. In the quiet hours of the evening, when Paris softened into shades of indigo and gold, Coco Chanel often retreated into her private world, a world far removed from the bustle of fashion houses and the glittering social circles that so often demanded her presence. Here, in the sanctuary of her apartment at the Ritz, she allowed herself to simply be, surrounded by the things that brought her comfort. The scent of freshly cut roses in a crystal vase, the weight of a well-worn book in her hands, the soft murmur of jazz drifting from a gramophone. Her mornings began slowly, with the ritual of black coffee, strong, bitter, never sweetened, sipped from a delicate porcelain cup. As she watched the city wake from her window, she believed in the importance of solitude, of giving herself time to think before the day's demands encroached. Sometimes she would sketch idly on a notepad, not for work, but for pleasure, letting her mind wander as her pencil traced fluid, effortless lines. She loved the act of creation, even when it served no purpose beyond bringing her peace. Her closest relationships were woven into the quiet moments as much as the grand ones. Messiah Cert, her dearest friend, often joined her for these unhurried mornings, the two women exchanging stories over coffee, their laughter as familiar as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Messiah understood her in a way few did: the sharp edges, the vulnerabilities, the fierce independence that sometimes bordered on loneliness. Their bond was one of shared confidences, of a mutual love for art and beauty, and of an unspoken understanding that neither needed to fill the silence between them. Then there was Pierre Reverdy, the poet whose words stirred something deep within her. Their relationship was one of intellect and passion, a meeting of minds that often unfolded in the dim light of her apartment late into the night. They debated philosophy, art, the nature of love, conversations that left her exhilarated and exhausted in equal measure. Reverdy saw the woman behind the legend, the one who hungered for meaning beyond the seams and stitches of her craft. Their love was never simple, never entirely peaceful, but it was real, and that was enough. And of course, there was Boy Capel, the love that never truly left her. Even years after his death, she kept his memory close, like a locket worn beneath her clothes. She never spoke of him often, but his presence lingered in the way she sometimes paused at the window, lost in thought, or in the faint smile that crossed her lips when a particular piece of music played. He had been the one who believed in her before the world did, who saw the fire in her and stoked it rather than feared it. His loss was a quiet ache, one she carried with grace but never forgot. Outside of her relationships, Chanel found solace in simple pleasures. She adored the opera, not just for the music, but for the spectacle, the way light caught the costumes, the drama of the performances, the collective breath of the audience in the darkened theater. She often attended alone, slipping into her seat unnoticed, content to lose herself in the swell of sound and emotion. She also had a deep love for the countryside, for the rolling hills of her beloved Château de la Croix. There, away from the demands of Paris, she could breathe. She walked for hours through the gardens, her fingers brushing the petals of roses she had planted herself, her mind free of the pressures of fashion and fame. She loved the scent of rain on earth, the way the light filtered through the trees in the late afternoon, the sound of birdsong at dawn. Nature, in its quiet constancy, reminded her of the simplicity she sometimes longed for. Her evenings often ended as they began in stillness. She enjoyed a glass of champagne, never more than one, sipped slowly as she listened to music or paged through a book of poetry. Sometimes she would write letters, her handwriting precise and elegant, her words carefully chosen. She believed in the power of a handwritten note, in the intimacy of ink on paper, and then, as the night deepened, she would retire to her bedroom, a sanctuary of white linens and soft light. She slept little, but when she did, it was with the windows open, the sounds of Paris drifting in, a distant hum of life that lulled her gently to sleep. Chanel's life was a tapestry of contrasts, fierce ambition and quiet reflection, dazzling fame and deep solitude. But in the end, it was the small moments that shaped her just as much as the grand ones. The touch of a friend's hand, the turn of a page, the scent of roses in the evening air. These were the threads that held her together, the quiet joys that made the weight of her legacy bearable. And as you drift toward sleep now, imagine her there, in the soft glow of lamplight, a woman who understood the beauty of both creation and stillness, who knew that life, like fashion, was nothing without the spaces between the seams. Let the rhythm of her story slow your breath, quiet your mind, until all that remains is the gentle whisper of history, carrying you into dreams. Good night. Like a gentle river flowing toward the sea, our story continues with the next meaningful chapter. Coco Chanel's days moved with the quiet precision of a well-tailored garment, each moment carefully stitched into the next, every habit a thread in the fabric of her life, from her earliest years in the convent orphanage to her reign over Parisian fashion. She carried with her a rhythm of routines, small rituals that grounded her amid the whirl of creativity and fame. Let us drift back into her world, moving slowly through the hours of her day, as gently as the turning of a page. In her youth at Aubusine, the mornings began early, with the cold light of dawn filtering through high windows. The nun's strict schedule left little room for idleness, and young Gabrielle learned the discipline of rising before the sun. She would wash her face in icy water, the shock of it sharpening her senses, and dress in the simple, severe uniforms of the orphanage. Breakfast was a quiet affair: bread, perhaps a little butter, eaten in silence. Even then, she noticed the way fabric fell, the way a collar could frame a face, storing these observations away like secrets. Later, when she had left the convent and was living with her aunt in Moulins, her mornings softened slightly. She would wake to the sound of birds outside the window, the air smelling of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. She took her time dressing, choosing her clothes with care. Even before she designed them, she understood their power. A cup of strong coffee, black and bitter, was her constant companion, a habit she would carry for life. Then off to work at the tailor's shop, where she stitched and sewed, her fingers moving with a quiet determination, already dreaming of something more. When she finally established herself in Paris, her routines deepened, becoming as much a part of her legend as her designs. She rose late, often around 10, luxuriating in the stillness of her apartment above the boutique on Rue Cambon. The room was bathed in soft light, the walls a pale cream, the furniture spare and elegant. She would stretch slowly, like a cat, before ringing for her maid to bring breakfast, a tray of toast, fruit, and always that strong black coffee. She ate lightly, almost absently, her mind already turning toward the day's work. Her dressing ritual was a performance in itself. She moved with deliberate grace, selecting each piece with the eye of an artist. A crisp white blouse, a strand of pearls, a simple skirt, her own designs, of course, but never fussy, never overwrought. She believed in the beauty of restraint, in the elegance of subtraction. A spritz of her signature perfume, Chanel No. 5, and she was ready. The scent lingered in the air, a whisper of jasmine and vanilla, as light and elusive as she was. Downstairs, the atelier hummed with activity. Seamstresses bent over their work tables, scissors flashed, pins glinted in the sunlight. Chanel moved among them like a conductor, her voice low but firm, her touch sure as she adjusted a sleeve here, a hem there. She worked with her hands, never afraid to kneel on the floor to pin a dress, her fingers deft and quick. The room was filled with the sound of rustling fabric, the quiet murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. She demanded perfection, but she also understood the humanity of her craft, the way a garment must move with the body, breathe with the wearer. Lunch was often taken at her favorite cafe, La Rotonde, where she would sit at a corner table, watching the world pass by. A simple meal, perhaps a salad, a piece of fish, a glass of white wine. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, her gaze sharp as she observed the women around her, noting the drape of a coat, the tilt of a hat. These moments of quiet observation were as vital to her work as the hours spent sketching at her desk. The afternoons were for meetings, for fittings with her most important clients, the actresses, the socialites, the women who shaped the world. They came to her, drawn by her genius. She received them in her private salon, a room of mirrored walls and plush sofas, where the light was always flattering. She spoke little, letting her hands do the talking as she adjusted a sleeve or pinned a waistline. There was an intimacy to these sessions, a trust between creator and wearer. The women left feeling transformed, not just dressed, but understood. As evening fell, she would retreat to her apartment, where the soft glow of lamplight replaced the harsh brightness of day. A cocktail, a gin and tonic, perhaps, was her reward for hours of labor. She would sit by the window, the city spread out below her, the Eiffel Tower twinkling in the distance. Sometimes she sketched, her pencil moving lightly over the paper, lines flowing into the shapes of future creations. Other times, she simply sat in silence, letting the quiet settle over her like a shawl. Dinner was a quiet affair, often taken alone or with a close friend. She preferred simple food, roast chicken, steamed vegetables, a glass of Bordeaux. Conversation, when there was any, was low and unhurried, the words drifting like smoke. She had no patience for small talk, for the empty chatter of society. She listened more than she spoke, her dark eyes missing nothing. And then, as the night deepened, she would retire to her bedroom, a sanctuary of white linens and soft light. She slept little, but when she did, it was with the windows open, the sounds of Paris drifting in a distant hum of life that lulled her gently to sleep. The scent of her perfume lingered on the pillows, mingling with the cool night air. In her later years at the Ritz, her routines slowed, but never lost their elegance. She still rose late, still dressed with care, still took her coffee black. The atelier was no longer hers, but she sketched in her notebooks, her hand as steady as ever. The rituals remained: the quiet mornings, the measured movements, the moments of stillness amid the rush of life. Coco Chanel understood that greatness was built not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet repetition of days, the way she held her scissors, the way she sipped her coffee, the way she paused to watch the light shift across the room. These were the stitches that held her life together. And as you drift towards sleep now, imagine her there in the hush of evening, a woman who knew the power of routine, the beauty of habit. Let the rhythm of her days slow your breath, soften your thoughts, until all that remains is the gentle whisper of time passing, carrying you into dreams. Good night. As your thoughts grow quieter, we'll continue our peaceful exploration of this fascinating life. Coco Chanel's philosophy was woven into the very fabric of her existence, a quiet rebellion against the excess and restriction of her time. She believed in the elegance of simplicity, the power of restraint, and the necessity of freedom, both in fashion and in life. Luxury must be comfortable, otherwise it is not luxury, she once said, a reflection of her belief that true sophistication lay not in opulence, but in ease. Her designs, like her worldview, were stripped of unnecessary ornament, revealing the beauty of clean lines and effortless movement from her earliest days in the Aubusine orphanage, where the starkness of the nuns' habits and the simplicity of their routines left an indelible mark. Chanel developed a distaste for the frivolous. She saw how the corsets of the Belle Epoque confined women, both physically and symbolically, and she resolved to liberate them. Her little black dress, her jersey fabrics, her rejection of the corset, these were not merely aesthetic choices, but declarations of independence. And her personal values were shaped by hardship and resilience. Abandonment and loss taught her self-reliance, a trait that would define her career. She refused to be bound by tradition or expectation, carving her own path in a world that had little patience for women who dared to lead. Success is often achieved by those who don't know that failure is inevitable, she mused, a testament to her stubborn optimism. Even in the face of setbacks, financial ruin, wartime exile, the fickleness of fashion, she persisted, her vision unwavering. Chanel's philosophy extended beyond clothing to the way she lived. She cherished solitude, not as loneliness, but as a space for creativity. Her apartment above the Rue Cambon Atelier was a carefully curated sanctuary, filled with objects that spoke to her: a crystal chandelier, a lacquered coromandel screen, a single sprig of camellias. Each piece was chosen with intention, a reflection of her belief that beauty should be meaningful, not merely decorative. "There is no time for cut-and-dried monotony," she said. "There is time for work, and time for love." Her relationships, too, were governed by a fierce independence. She loved deeply, but never at the cost of her autonomy. The men in her life, Boy Capel, the Duke of Westminster, even the poet peer Reverdy, were drawn to her brilliance, but none could possess her entirely. "I never wanted to weigh more heavily on a man than a bird," she remarked, a sentiment that captured her refusal to be dependent. She understood that love, like fashion, should never constrain. As she grew older, her philosophy deepened rather than dimmed. The war years had forced her into exile, but when she returned to Paris in 1954, at the age of 71, she did so with the same defiance that had marked her youth. Critics dismissed her comeback collection as outdated, but she was unshaken. Her revival of the Chanel suit, its boxy silhouette, its gold chain-weighted hem, was a reaffirmation of her core belief that clothing should serve the woman, not the other way around. Even in her final years at the Ritz, her routines remained a study in disciplined elegance. She rose late, dressed meticulously, and received visitors in her suite, where the light fell softly across her iconic pieces. She still sketched, still dictated letters, still insisted on perfection in the smallest details. This was her guiding principle, the thread that ran through every decision, every creation. Chanel's legacy is not just in the clothes she designed, but in the way she thought. She rejected the notion that a woman must choose between beauty and intelligence, between strength and grace. "A woman who doesn't wear perfume has no future," she once quipped. But her words carried a deeper truth, that self-expression, in all its forms, was essential. Her own signature scent, Chanel No. 5, was revolutionary precisely because it was unlike anything else. Complex, bold, impossible to ignore, just like its creator. As night settles and the sounds of Paris hum beyond the window, imagine her there, sitting at her mirrored vanity, tracing the lines of a new design, or simply watching the play of shadows on the wall. Her life was a testament to the power of conviction, the beauty of simplicity, the quiet strength of knowing who you are. And as you drift toward sleep, let her philosophy ease your mind that greatness is found not in noise, but in the whisper of silk, the precision of a seam, the courage to be yourself. Good night. With each breath becoming slower and deeper, let us turn to another aspect of this soothing story. Coco Chanel's life, though glittering with success, was far from effortless. Like the finest silk, her strength was woven through hardship, each thread a lesson learned through struggle. Her path was not smooth, nor was it straight. It wound through loss, rejection, and moments when the world seemed determined to silence her. Yet, with each challenge, she found a way to reshape herself, to emerge not just unbroken, but more resolute. Her earliest years were marked by absence. Born in 1883 to a humble family in Saumur, France, young Gabrielle, later to be known as Coco, was only 12 when her mother passed away. Her father, unable to care for her, left her at an orphanage in Aubazine, run by strict nuns. The stone walls of the convent were cold, the routines rigid. But it was here that she first learned the quiet discipline that would later define her work. The nuns taught her to sew with meticulous care, their needles moving in steady rhythm, stitches precise and unyielding. Though the days were long and lonely, those silent hours at the sewing table planted in her a reverence for craftsmanship, for the beauty of things made by hand. When she left the orphanage at 18, the world outside was unwelcoming. The nights were long, the audiences fickle, but she refused to be defined by hardship. Instead, she observed. She noticed the way women moved in their corsets, how the stiff fabrics of the time restricted them, and she began to imagine something different, something free. Her first venture into fashion came with the help of Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir who became her lover, and for a time, her patron. Through him, she met Arthur Boy Capel, the man who would become the great love of her life, and the one who believed in her vision enough to finance her first hat shop in Paris. For a while, it seemed luck had turned in her favor, but the world was not yet ready for a woman who dared to build an empire. The early days were slow, the customers hesitant. Many dismissed her designs as too simple, too plain compared to the ornate, suffocating styles of the time. Then, in 1919, tragedy struck. Boy Capel, the man who had supported her dreams, died suddenly in a car accident. The loss shattered her. For months, she withdrew, grieving in the shadows of her empty apartment. But even in her sorrow, she understood that the only way forward was to work. she threw herself into her designs, channeling her grief into creation. It was during this time that she introduced the little black dress, a garment so revolutionary in its simplicity that it would change fashion forever in a world still clinging to bright colors and heavy embellishment. She offered women a new kind of elegance, understated, powerful, and undeniably modern. Yet, even success could not shield her from the turbulence of the world. The 1930s brought financial crises, and the outbreak of World War II forced her to close her shops. Worse still, her association with a German officer during the occupation of Paris would later cast a shadow over her reputation, leading many to question her loyalties. When the war ended, she was exiled to Switzerland, her name tarnished, her business in ruins. For years, it seemed her legacy might end there, a brilliant flame extinguished by circumstance. But Coco Chanel was not a woman who accepted defeat. In 1954, at the age of 71, she staged a comeback. Paris had changed, fashion had moved on, and critics sneered that her time had passed, yet she ignored them. With the same quiet determination that had carried her through the orphanage, through loss, through war, she returned to her atelier. She reintroduced her iconic tweed suits, the quilted handbags, the effortless elegance that had once defined her work. Slowly, the world remembered. Younger designers, who had once dismissed her as outdated, now looked to her as the mother of modern fashion. The obstacles never truly ended. There were lawsuits, rivals, moments when the weight of her past threatened to pull her under. But she had learned long ago that resilience was not about avoiding hardship. It was about moving through it, stitch by careful stitch. She once said, "Hard times arouse an instinctive desire for authenticity," and in those words lay the secret to her endurance. Every setback had refined her, stripped away what was unnecessary, leaving only what was true. As you drift deeper into sleep, think of her not as an untouchable icon, but as a woman who knew the taste of struggle. A woman who remade herself again and again from the fragments life left her, the orphan, the mistress, the grieving lover, the exile each version of her carried forward, woven into the tapestry of her brilliance. And perhaps there is comfort in that. For if she could rise time and time again, then so too can we. Let the rhythm of her story lull you now, the steady rise and fall of a life well lived, a testament to the quiet power of persistence. The night is soft around you, the air still, and somewhere beyond the darkness, the legacy of Coco Chanel endures, not in spite of the obstacles, but because of them. Sleep well. The tapestry of this remarkable life unfolds further as we gently explore the next meaningful period beneath the polished surface of Coco Chanel's public image, the sharp suits, the little black dress, the scent of number 5 lingering in the air. There was a woman full of quiet contradictions, private passions, and unexpected tenderness. Few knew, for example, that that she had a deep love for poetry, often reciting verses by heart in the quiet hours of the night, when the world was hushed and the weight of her ambitions could be momentarily set aside. She admired the works of Verlaine and Rimbaud, their words resonating with her own restless spirit, the same spirit that had carried her from an orphanage in Aubusine to the glittering heights of Parisian society. In the stillness of her apartment above the Rue Cambon, she would sometimes sit by the window, gazing at the rooftops of Paris, a book of poems in her lap. The rhythm of the verses soothed her, their cadence a gentle counterpoint to the precision of her designs. Poetry, for her, was not just an escape. It was a reminder of beauty in imperfection, of emotions too raw to be confined by seams and stitches. She had another hidden talent, one that rarely made its way into the pages of fashion magazines. She was an extraordinary gardener. At La Posa, her villa in the south of France, she would spend hours tending to the roses, lavender, and jasmine that perfumed the air. There was something meditative in the act of digging her hands into the earth, of coaxing life from the soil with patience and care. It was a quiet rebellion, perhaps, against the rigid elegance of her public persona, a way to reconnect with the simplicity she had known as a girl before fame reshaped her. And then there were her superstitions, little rituals that revealed a surprisingly vulnerable side. She despised the number 5, ironic, given the success of her most famous fragrance, and would go to great lengths to avoid it, rearranging furniture or adjusting schedules if the number appeared too prominently. She carried a small, worn St. Christopher medal in her pocket, a talisman against misfortune, and would sometimes whisper to it in moments of doubt. These small, superstitious habits were the remnants of a woman who, despite her towering confidence, still carried the scars of a childhood marked by abandonment. Her relationship with animals was another rarely spoken facet of her life. She adored her pets, particularly her beloved blue Persian cat, whom she would sometimes let curl up on her work table as she sketched. There was an unguarded tenderness in the way she spoke to them, a softness she rarely showed to people. Animals, she once remarked, did not judge, did not betray, they simply loved, unconditionally. Even her famed independence had its contradictions. Though she built an empire on the idea of the modern, self-sufficient woman, she was not immune to longing for companionship. In her later years, she would sometimes invite old friends to dine with her, not to discuss business or fashion, but simply to reminisce, to laugh over shared memories. These evenings were intimate, unhurried, a far cry from the glittering parties of her youth. She would serve simple meals, perhaps a perfectly roasted chicken, a salad dressed with lemon and olive oil, and the conversation would drift into the night, slow and meandering, like smoke from one of her ever-present cigarettes. And then there was her voice. Those who knew her well often remarked on it, soft, almost husky, with with a warmth that belied her sharp wit. She could be fiercely opinionated, yes, but she also knew the power of silence, of listening. In private, she sometimes sang old French folk songs, her voice low and melodic, a habit left over from her days as a cabaret performer. Music, like poetry, was a thread that ran through her life, a reminder of emotions too deep for words alone. Perhaps most surprising of all was her love of the sea. She found solace in its vastness, in the way the waves moved with a rhythm that was both relentless and calming. At her retreat in Roquebrune, she would often walk along the shore at dawn, the salt air mingling with the scent of her perfume. There, with the horizon stretching endlessly before her, she could briefly let go of the weight of her name, of the legend she had become, and simply be Gabrielle once more, just a woman, standing at the edge of the world, breathing in the quiet beauty of another morning. These small, hidden fragments of her life remind us that even the most iconic figures are, at heart, human. They loved and feared, cherished secret joys, clung to small comforts, and as you drift toward sleep tonight, let that thought settle over you like a soft blanket. That greatness is not forged in perfection, but in the quiet, messy, beautiful imperfections of a life fully lived. The night is deep now, the stars faintly visible through the curtains. Somewhere in the stillness, the memory of Coco Chanel lingers, not just as a titan of fashion, but as a woman who knew the sweetness of simple things, who found poetry in the ordinary, who carried her scars with grace. And as sleep gently claims you, may you too find comfort in the knowledge that even the brightest stars were once just flickers in the dark, learning how to shine. As you settle more comfortably, our narrative flows onward like soft moonlight across still waters. To understand Coco Chanel, we must first drift back to the world she was born into, a world of corsets and carriages, of rigid social hierarchies and whispered rebellions. She entered life in 1883 in the quiet French town of Sommer, a time when Europe was still draped in the heavy fabrics of the Victorian era. Women moved through their days, swathed in layers of silk and whalebone, their bodies shaped by expectations as much as by their tightly laced stays. The streets bustled with horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps flickered in the evening, and the air hummed with the distant promise of change. It was a world on the cusp of transformation, though no one could have guessed that a girl from an orphanage would one day help redefine it. As young Gabrielle grew, so too did the world around her. The turn of the century brought with it the faint tremors of modernity. Electric lights began to glow in the grand boulevards of Paris. The first automobiles sputtered along cobblestone streets, and artists like Picasso and Matisse started to fracture the old ways of seeing. The Belle Epoque, they called it the beautiful era, a time of gilded excess and whispered decadence. Yet, beneath the surface, something restless stirred. Women, for centuries confined to the drawing room, were beginning to demand more. They rode bicycles in daring divided skirts, smoked cigarettes in public, and dreamed of lives beyond the parlor. Chanel, with her sharp wit and hungry ambition, absorbed it all like a sponge. Then came the earthquake of the First World War, shattering the old order into jagged pieces. The men marched away, and suddenly women were needed in factories, in offices, in roles once reserved for their husbands and brothers. The heavy, ornate dresses of the past became impractical, too cumbersome for a woman who now worked, who moved, who needed to breathe. Chanel, ever observant, saw the shift before most. She began creating clothes that mirrored this new reality, simple, fluid, unburdened by unnecessary frills. Her designs whispered of freedom. Trousers for women, little black dresses that could take you from day to night, jersey fabrics that moved with the body rather than against it. It was as if she had distilled the spirit of the age into thread and cloth. The 1920s arrived like a burst of jazz, reckless and bright. The war was over, and the world, weary of sorrow, threw itself into celebration. Flappers danced in speakeasies, hemlines rose, and Chanel's sleek, androgynous silhouettes became the uniform of the modern woman. Paris was the beating heart of it all, a city alive with artists and writers, with Hemingway and Fitzgerald weaving their stories amid the smoke of cafe tables. Chanel held court among them, her apartment at 31 Rue Cambon a sanctuary of black lacquer and mirrors, where creativity crackled in the air like static. She was no longer just a dressmaker. She was a force, a woman who had taken the fragments of a broken world and reassembled them into something bold and new. Yet the sea, that constant presence in her life, remained her quiet companion. Just as the waves returned again and again to the shore, so too did Chanel return to the simplicity of the coast, to the salt-stung winds of Roquebrune and the calm of Deauville. Even as her empire expanded, even as her name became synonymous with luxury, she never lost her love for the unadorned beauty of nature. The sand between her toes, the cry of gulls overhead, these were the things that grounded her, that reminded her of the girl she had once been. The world shifted once more with the dark clouds of the Second World War, and Chanel, like so many, found herself navigating a landscape of uncertainty. The post-war years brought a hunger for renewal, for joy after so much sorrow. Christian Dior's new look, with its voluminous skirts and nipped-in waists, seemed a rejection of Chanel's sleek modernity. For a time, the whispers said she was finished, a relic of a bygone era. But Chanel, ever stubborn, ever resilient, waited. And then, in 1954, at the age of 71, she staged a comeback. The world, it turned out, still craved her vision, the effortless elegance, the quiet confidence of a woman who dressed for herself. By the time she passed away in 1971, the world had transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable in her childhood. The stiff formality of the 19th century had given way to the free-spirited experimentation of the 1960s. And yet, Chanel's influence remained. Woven into the very fabric of fashion, her story was not just one of hemlines and handbags, but of a woman who had lived through seismic shifts, who had witnessed wars and revolutions, who had seen the role of women evolve from decoration to determination. And so, as the night deepens around you, think of her not as an untouchable icon, but as a woman who navigated the currents of history with the same quiet grace she brought to her morning walks by the sea. The world she was born into no longer exists, and yet her fingerprints are everywhere in the way a jacket drapes, in the confidence of a woman in trousers, in the enduring allure of simplicity. History is not just made of grand battles and treaties. It is made of small, personal revolutions, of choices that ripple outward. Chanel's life was one such ripple, a testament to the power of seeing the world differently and daring to reshape it. As sleep draws nearer, let the weight of history settle softly around you. The past is not so distant as it seems. It lingers in the clothes we wear, the freedoms we take for granted, the quiet moments of beauty we choose to cherish. And somewhere, beyond the edges of memory, Gabrielle Chanel still stands by the shore, watching the tide come in, reminding us that even the grandest stories begin with a single step, one foot in front of the other, walking toward the horizon. Let the rhythm of these words carry you further into relaxation as we continue our peaceful journey. Coco Chanel's influence was like the quiet, steady turning of the tide, so gradual that one might not notice it at first. And yet, with time, it reshaped the very shoreline of culture. She did not simply design clothes. She designed a new way of living. In the early 20th century, when women were still constrained by corsets and layers of fabric, Chanel offered them something radical. Freedom, the freedom to move, to breathe, to exist without the weight of ornamentation pressing down on them. It began with something as simple as a dress, soft, unstructured, draping the body rather than forcing it into unnatural shapes. It was a whisper of change in a world that had long demanded women be seen, but not heard. Her little black dress, now an icon of timeless elegance, was at first a quiet rebellion. In the 1920s, black was reserved for mourning. Yet Chanel saw its potential, a canvas of simplicity that could be endlessly reinvented. She stripped away the excess, leaving only what was essential, and in doing so, she gave women not just a garment, but a statement. A woman in Chanel's black dress was not hiding. She was commanding attention on her own terms. The world took notice. What began as a murmur of curiosity grew into a chorus of admiration. Soon, women from Paris to New York were embracing this new language of style, one that spoke of confidence rather than compliance. But Chanel's revolution did not stop at clothing. She understood that fashion was not just about what one wore, but how one lived. She borrowed elements from men's wardrobes, trousers, tailored blazers, even the humble Breton stripe, and made them not just acceptable for women, but desirable in a time when women in pants were still met with raised eyebrows. Chanel wore them herself, casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And slowly, society began to agree. The boundaries between masculine and feminine blurred, not with a shout, but with the quiet insistence of a woman who refused to be bound by convention. Perfume, too, became part of her legacy. Chanel No. 5, with its clean, abstract composition, broke from the heavy, floral scents of the past. It was modern, elusive, a fragrance that did not announce itself with sweetness, but lingered like a thought just out of reach. When Marilyn Monroe famously said she wore nothing to bed but a few drops of Chanel No. 5, she was not just endorsing a perfume, she was echoing Chanel's philosophy. Luxury was not about excess, but about essence. The bottle itself, with its stark geometric lines, was a reflection of this belief: beauty in simplicity, elegance in restraint. Yet, not everyone embraced her vision immediately. To some, her designs seemed too plain, almost austere. Critics wondered where the embellishments were, the frills, the grandeur they associated with high fashion. But Chanel was patient. She knew that true style was not about decoration, but about harmony. A woman should wear the clothes she believed, not the other way around. Over time, even her detractors came to see the wisdom in her approach. By the mid-20th century, her influence was undeniable. Designers who had once dismissed her were now borrowing her principles, weaving them into their own work. The fashion world had shifted, and Chanel had been its quiet architect. Her impact stretched far beyond the ateliers of Paris. In film, in art, in the way women carried themselves, Chanel's aesthetic became a kind of shorthand for modernity. Actresses like Audrey Hepburn and Grace Kelly, with their effortless sophistication, were living testaments to her vision. Even outside the realm of high society, ordinary women found liberation in her designs. A Chanel suit, with its boxy silhouette and practical pockets, was not just for aristocrats. It was for anyone who wanted to feel both polished and at ease. And then there was the way she lived her life, unapologetically, on her own terms. She never married, preferring independence to the constraints of traditional roles. She surrounded herself with artists, writers, and thinkers, drawing inspiration from the world around her. Her love affairs were as much a part of her legend as her designs, not because they were scandalous, but because they reflected her refusal to be defined by anyone else's expectations. In an era when women were often reduced to their relationships, Chanel remained stubbornly, gloriously herself. By the time of her death in 1971, the world had changed in ways that mirrored her own journey. The rigid hierarchies of her youth had crumbled, replaced by a new spirit of individuality. The women's liberation movement was in full swing, and though Chanel herself was not a vocal feminist, her life's work had paved the way for many of its ideals. She had shown that a woman could build an empire, that she could defy convention without apology, that she could shape culture rather than simply conform to it. Today, her name is synonymous with timeless elegance, but it is worth remembering how radical that elegance once was. The Chanel jacket, the quilted handbag, the two-tone shoes, each was a small revolution in its own right. They were not just beautiful objects, but symbols of a woman's right to define herself. Walk into any department store now, and you will see her influence everywhere. In the clean lines of a blazer, in the understated glamour of a black dress, even in the way perfume is packaged and presented. But perhaps her greatest legacy is the idea that fashion is not frivolous. It is a language, a way of telling the world who you are without saying a word. Chanel taught us that what we wear matters, not because it makes us beautiful, but because it makes us feel free. And in a world that still tries to dictate how women should look and act, that lesson is as vital as ever. So, as you drift toward sleep, think of her not as a distant figure from a bygone era, but as a presence that lingers in the everyday, in the way a woman ties her scarf just so, in the confidence of a well-tailored silhouette, in the quiet pleasure of a scent that feels like home. Chanel's world was one of subtlety and strength, and though the tides of fashion will always ebb and flow, her imprint remains soft, persistent, like the whisper of waves against the shore. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it, the faintest echo of her voice, reminding us that elegance is not about standing out, but about belonging to oneself. That the simplest choices can be the most profound, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to be. Let that thought carry you into sleep, gentle as the drape of a silk dress, steady as the hands that once stitched it. The past is not so far away as it seems. It is here, in the clothes we choose, in the way we move through the world, in the small, quiet rebellions that shape our lives. And somewhere beyond the edges of memory, Chanel is still there watching, waiting, her legacy unfolding one stitch at a time with the gentleness of falling snow. We transition now to another meaningful chapter in this life story. There was something about the way Coco Chanel moved through the world, a quiet defiance, an unshakable certainty in her own vision, born into poverty in the small French town of Sommer. Young Gabrielle, later to be called Coco, spent her childhood in an orphanage after her mother passed away and her father left. The nuns there taught her to sew, a skill that would become the foundation of her empire. But more than that, they instilled in her a discipline, a meticulous attention to detail that would later define her work. One of the lesser-known stories from her youth speaks to her stubborn independence. As a girl, she hated the frilly, constricting dresses that were the fashion of the time. she would secretly alter them, removing excess lace, simplifying the lines, small acts of rebellion that foreshadowed her future. Even then, she understood that true elegance was not about excess, but about ease. Her early adulthood was marked by struggle and reinvention. She worked as a seamstress by day and sang in cabarets by night, where she earned the nickname Coco Asterisk, some say from a popular song she performed. Others claim it was shorthand for asterisk cocotte asterisk, a French term for a kept woman. Whatever the origin, the name stuck, and with it, she began to shed her past, crafting a new identity as deliberately as she would later craft her designs. It was during her time as a mistress to Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir, that she first dipped her toes into the world of high society. Balsan's stable of racehorses introduced her to the world of men's tailoring, a revelation. She began borrowing his shirts and jackets, cinching them at the waist, transforming masculine silhouettes into something entirely her own. Later, when she opened her first hat shop in Paris, with the financial backing of another lover, Arthur Boy Capel, she continued to draw inspiration from menswear. Her designs were clean, unfussy, a stark contrast to the corseted extravagance of the Belle Epoque. One of her most defining moments came in 1919, when Boy Capel, the love of her life, died tragically in a car accident. Heartbroken, she immersed herself in work, and it was during this period that she introduced her signature little black dress. At the time, black was reserved for mourning, but Chanel saw something else in it, a blank canvas, a statement of timeless simplicity. When Vogue featured her design in 1926, they called it the Ford of dresses, asterisk comparing its universal appeal to the Model T. It was a quiet revolution, one that would forever change how women dressed. Her personal life was as unconventional as her designs. She never married, though she had many high-profile romances, from the Duke of Westminster to the poet Pierre Reverdy. She preferred costume jewelry, mixing fake pearls with real ones, dismantling the idea that value had to be ostentatious. Perhaps one of the most revealing anecdotes about Chanel comes from her later years, when she staged her famous comeback in 1954. After closing her fashion house during World War II, she retreated to Switzerland, her reputation tarnished by rumors of collaboration with the Nazis. But at the age of 71, she returned to Paris, determined to reclaim her place in fashion. Critics dismissed her first post-war collection, calling it outdated. But Chanel, ever the visionary, remained unfazed. Within a few seasons, her tweed suits, quilted bags, and two-tone shoes had once again become the epitome of chic. She proved that style had no expiration date. Even in her final years, she maintained her disciplined routine, rising early, working tirelessly, always dressed immaculately. She slept in a plain white bedroom, her only indulgence a single crystal chandelier. When when she passed away in 1971 at the age of 87, she was still at work, sketching new designs the day before her death. It's easy to think of Chanel as just a name on a perfume bottle or a handbag, but she was so much more. She was a woman who refused to be bound by convention, who turned hardship into innovation, who understood that true luxury was not in extravagance, but in restraint. Her legacy lingers not just in fashion, but in the way we think about independence, about reinvention, about the quiet power of simplicity. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine her in her atelier, fingers tracing the lines of a jacket, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Picture her walking through Paris at dawn, wrapped in one of her own designs, moving effortlessly through the world she helped shape. And remember, just as she believed that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply to be yourself. Let that thought settle over you, soft as cashmere, gentle as the closing of a well-worn book. The night is quiet, the past is near, and somewhere, Chanel is still stitching her story into the fabric of time. As your eyelids grow heavier, we'll softly explore another dimension of this fascinating biography. In the quiet twilight of her life, Coco Chanel remained, as she always had been, restless, exacting, utterly devoted to her craft. Even as the world around her shifted, as fashion trends came and went like passing seasons, she stayed rooted in her vision, refining the principles she had built her empire upon. The 1960s had brought a whirlwind of change, youthquake fashion, miniskirts, psychedelic prints. But Chanel, now in her 80s, remained unmoved by fleeting fads. She returned to her work with the same precision, the same certainty, as though time had no hold on her. Her daily rituals were unchanged. She rose at dawn, dressed in her signature uniform, a crisp, collarless jacket, a string of pearls, and trousers that whispered of quiet rebellion. Then made her way to her beloved atelier at 31 Rue Cambon. The space still hummed with the same energy it had decades before, filled with the hush of fabric being cut, the rhythmic click of needles, the occasional murmur of a seamstress at work. Chanel moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who knew every corner, every shadow, every breath the place had ever taken. The later collections she designed were subtle evolutions of her timeless aesthetic. She revisited the tweed suits that had made her famous, adjusting a seam here, softening a silhouette there, ensuring they remained as modern as they were classic. She never pandered to the loud, brash styles of the era. Instead, she refined her designs with the steady hand of a master who knew that true elegance was not about shouting, but about speaking in a voice so clear it needed no volume. And yet, the world was not always kind to her in those final years. Some critics dismissed her as a relic, out of touch with the radical changes of the time. Younger designers, swept up in the energy of the 60s, saw her as part of the old guard, but Chanel paid them little mind. She had spent a lifetime defying expectations, and she was not about to start conforming now. Those who truly understood fashion, those who could see beyond the noise, recognized that her work was not about trends, but about something deeper, something enduring. Her influence was everywhere, even when it went unspoken. The little black dress, once revolutionary, had become a staple in every woman's wardrobe. The Chanel suit, with its clean lines and understated luxury, was still the uniform of choice for women who valued both comfort and sophistication. And her perfumes, most famously, Chanel No. 5, remained a symbol of timeless allure, a scent that whispered of elegance, independence, and quiet confidence. But beyond the clothes and the fragrances, beyond the pearls and the quilted handbags, Chanel's greatest legacy was the way she had redefined what it meant to be a woman in the modern world. She had lived by her own rules, refusing to apologize for her ambition, her independence, her unshakable belief in her own vision. She had taken the constraints of her time, poverty, war, societal expectations, and turned them into something entirely her own. As the years passed, she became more reflective, though never sentimental. She spoke little of the past, preferring to live in the present, in the next design, the next idea. But occasionally, in rare moments, she would let her mind wander back to the orphanage where she learned to sew, to the small hat shop that had been her first taste of success, to the lovers and friends who had come and gone. She carried those memories lightly, like stitches in a well-worn garment, each one part of the fabric of who she was. On the morning of January 10, 1971, she worked as usual, sketching a new design, her hands steady despite her age. That evening, she retired to her simple white bedroom at the Ritz, the crystal chandelier casting delicate shadows across the walls. She did not wake the next morning. The news of her death spread quickly, and tributes poured in from around the world. Designers, editors, artists, and women who had never met her but had been shaped by her work all paused to honor her. They spoke of her genius, her defiance, her unwavering commitment to her craft. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the silence that followed, the quiet understanding that some legacies are so deeply woven into the world that they need no fanfare. Today, her name still graces boutiques and perfume counters, but her true influence is far more subtle, far more profound. It's in the way a woman stands a little taller in a well-cut jacket, the way she chooses simplicity over excess, the way she carries herself with the quiet assurance that she owes nothing to anyone's expectations. Chanel did not just design clothes, she designed a way of living. So as you drift into sleep, imagine her still there, in the soft glow of the atelier, her hands moving with quiet certainty. Picture the way the light catches the pearls at her neck, the way the fabric falls just so, the way her eyes sharp, knowing take in every detail. And know that her story is not just one of fashion, but of resilience, of reinvention, of the quiet power of staying true to oneself. The night is deep now, the world outside hushed and still. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between memory and dream, Chanel is still working, still creating, still stitching her vision into the tapestry of time. And as you close your eyes, you can almost hear the whisper of silk, the faint click of scissors, the sound of a legacy that never fades. Sleep gently, knowing that some things, like true elegance, are timeless. The gentle cadence of our story continues, flowing like a peaceful stream through the next chapter. Coco Chanel's legacy is like a quiet melody that plays through the decades, soft but impossible to ignore. It lingers in the way women dress, in the way they move through the world, in the unspoken confidence that comes from knowing one can be both effortless and extraordinary. Her influence did not fade with the passing of seasons. It simply settled deeper, weaving itself into the very fabric of modern life. Think of the little black dress, that simplest of garments, now a staple in every woman's wardrobe. Before Chanel, black was reserved for mourning. After her, it became a symbol of sophistication, of independence. Designers still return to it, season after season, reimagining its lines, its textures, but never altering its essence. It remains, as she intended, a blank canvas, a way for a woman to say everything without uttering a word. Or consider the Chanel suit, with its boxy silhouette, its whispered rebellion against the corsets and frills of the past. It was more than clothing. It was armor, a declaration that a woman could command respect without sacrificing comfort. Today, you see its echoes in the structured blazers of Phoebe Philo's designs for sailing, in the clean lines of Jill Sanders' minimalist collections. These designers did not copy Chanel. They absorbed her philosophy, the belief that fashion should serve the woman, not the other way around. Even her love of menswear, her borrowing of trousers, of tweed, of collared shirts, was a quiet revolution. She did not shout her defiance. She simply dressed as she pleased, and in doing so, gave other women permission to do the same. Diane Keaton, decades later, would channel that same spirit in her androgynous suits, in Asterisk, Annie Hall Asterisk, a film that made casual elegance seem not just stylish, but natural. And today, women like Tilda Swinton continue that tradition, gliding through red carpets in tailored suits that blur the lines between masculine and feminine, just as Chanel once did. Her perfumes, too, carry her legacy forward. Chanel No. 5 was not just a scent. It was the first fragrance to bear a designer's name, a bold statement that luxury could be personal, intimate. Even now, perfumers speak of it in reverent tones, its aldehyde notes still as modern as they were in 1921. Brands like Le Labo and Byredo build upon her idea that a fragrance is not just an accessory, but an extension of identity. But perhaps her greatest gift was the way she redefined what it meant to be a woman in the world. She refused to be confined by the expectations of her time, whether in love, in business, or in art. She built an empire when women were seldom seen in boardrooms, and she did it with a quiet determination that never hardened into cruelty. Young designers still look to her as a guiding light. Karl Lagerfeld, who helmed Chanel for over 3 decades, did not merely preserve her vision. He played with it, stretched it, made it relevant for new generations. His runway shows were spectacles. Yes, but at their core, they honored her belief in simplicity, in quality, in the power of a single perfect stitch. And now, Virginie Viard carries the torch, blending Chanel's timeless codes with a softer, more romantic touch. The house still produces tweed jackets, still strings pearls just so, but it also embraces modernity, sneakers with suits, neon hues against classic neutrals. It is proof that Chanel's spirit is not frozen in the past, but alive, evolving. Beyond fashion, her influence seeps into other realms. Writers, filmmakers, even architects speak of her principles: the beauty of restraint, the elegance of function, the sleek lines of mid-century modern furniture, the uncluttered spaces of Scandinavian design. Even the pared-down prose of authors like Joan Didion all carry whispers of Chanel's belief that less is more. Yet her legacy is not without its complexities. Some have questioned her choices, her alliances, the contradictions of a woman who preached liberation, while sometimes aligning herself with those who sought to restrict it. But even these debates are part of her story, proof that she was never a saint, never a myth, only a woman, flawed and extraordinary, who changed the world in ways she could not have imagined. And so, as you drift toward sleep, think of how her touch still lingers. In the woman who throws on a blazer and feels instantly powerful. In the girl who spritzes on perfume not to please others, but because it makes her feel like herself. In the designer who looks at an old Chanel sketch and sees not just history, but possibility. The night is soft around you now, the air still, the world hushed. Somewhere in a studio in Paris, a new collection is being dreamed up, threads of the past woven into something fresh. And somewhere, too, in the quiet of your own mind, Chanel's lessons remain that elegance is not about perfection, but about ease. That true style is not worn, but lived. Sleep now, wrapped in the knowledge that some ideas never grow old, that a woman who once sat at a sewing machine in a small hat shop still shapes the way we move through the world, and that her voice, though quiet, will always be there in the whisper of fabric, in the gleam of pearls, in the unshakable belief that a woman's greatest luxury is her freedom. Wrapped in the comfort of these words, we'll drift together into the next part of this soothing biography. The story of Coco Chanel is often told in broad strokes: a rags to riches tale, a revolutionary designer, the woman who freed women from corsets and gave them the little black dress. But like all legends, the truth is softer, more complicated, woven with threads of contradiction and nuance that often get lost in the retelling. As you settle into the quiet of the night, let's gently unravel some of the myths that have grown around her, like ivy creeping over an old stone wall, obscuring the shape of what lies beneath. One of the most enduring myths is that Chanel single-handedly invented modern women's fashion. It's a comforting idea, the lone genius reshaping the world. But history is rarely so simple. The truth is, she was part of a larger movement, a tide of change that had already begun to rise. Women were stepping into new roles, riding bicycles, working in offices, and the stiff, ornate fashions of the past no longer suited their lives. Chanel didn't create this shift. She listened to it, refined it, gave it elegance. Her genius was in sensing what women wanted before they fully knew it themselves. She took the loose, practical styles of sportswear and fishermen's sweaters and elevated them into something sophisticated. But she didn't do it alone. The whispers of change were already in the air. Another common simplification is the idea that Chanel's style was always minimalist, always austere. In reality, her work was full of quiet opulence. Think of the way she used jersey, a humble fabric, yes, but cut and draped to move like liquid. Think of her love of pearls, not strung in perfect rows, but layered carelessly, as if they had been tossed on without a second thought. Even her famous little black dress was never just plain. It was the way it was constructed, the way it hugged the body or swung away from it, that made it extraordinary. Chanel didn't reject luxury. She redefined it, making it feel effortless, something you could live in rather than merely wear. Then there's the myth of her independence, the idea that she was entirely self-made. It's a story she herself helped cultivate, speaking little of the wealthy lovers who supported her early career, the connections that opened doors. This doesn't diminish her brilliance. Talent alone is rarely enough to rise from an orphanage to the heights of Parisian society, but it does remind us that even the most singular figures are shaped by the people around them. Chanel was a master of reinvention, not just of fashion, but of her own story. She knew the power of myth, how it could elevate an idea into something timeless. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of her legacy is her complicated relationship with femininity. She is often celebrated for borrowing from menswear, for giving women trousers and boxy jackets, as if this were a rejection of womanhood itself. But Chanel never wanted women to dress like men. She wanted them to dress like themselves. Her designs celebrated the female form even as they freed it. A Chanel suit wasn't a disguise. It was armor, yes, but armor that allowed for grace, for movement, for breath. She adored lace, ribbons, delicate chains, things that shimmered and whispered. Her femininity wasn't fragile. It was formidable. And then there are the shadows in her story, the parts that are harder to reconcile with the icon we know today, her wartime years, the rumors of collaboration, The way she closed her salon during the occupation, only to reopen it with a new collection just weeks after liberation. History is rarely kind to those who survive upheaval with their reputations intact. And Chanel was nothing if not a survivor. The full truth may never be known, lost in the fog of war and the passage of time, but it's a reminder that even the most luminous figures are human, shaped by their moments of weakness as much as their triumphs. What's most fascinating is how Chanel's contradictions only deepen her legacy. She was a woman who prized simplicity, but lived in ornate apartments filled with gilded mirrors. She spoke of freedom, yet built an empire on the idea of timeless, unchanging style. She dismissed nostalgia, even as she wove it into her designs. The quilting of a saddlebag, repurposed for a handbag. The camellias that bloomed again and again in her collections. She was a modernist who loved the past, a rebel who became an institution. As you drift closer to sleep, think of how these complexities make her more real, more alive. The myths are beautiful, yes, but the truth is richer, full of textures and layers, like a well-worn tweed jacket or a strand of pearls warmed by skin. Chanel wasn't just a designer. She was a woman who understood the power of image, the weight of a hemline, the quiet rebellion in a well-placed pocket. Her legacy isn't just in the clothes she made, but in the way she taught us to see ourselves, not as figures in a painting, but as people in motion. And so, as the night cradles you, remember that even icons are human, that the stories we tell about them are just that, stories, shaped by time and memory, and the need for heroes. But the real magic lies in the gaps, the unanswered questions, the moments when the legend fades, and all that's left is a woman at a work table, pinning fabric to a dress form, searching for the line that feels just right. Sleep now, wrapped in the knowledge that history is never simple, that even the most polished tales have their rough edges. And somewhere, in the quiet between waking and dreaming, perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of Chanel as she truly was, not a myth, but a person, stitching together a vision of the world, one seam at a time. Now, as we continue our gentle journey through this remarkable life, let us explore the next chapter. Coco Chanel's life was like a piece of fabric, rich, textured, and impossible to reduce to a single thread. She was a woman who stitched together contradictions, weaving poverty and luxury, restraint and rebellion into something entirely new. As you sink deeper into the quiet of night, let the story of her life unfold softly in your mind, not as a list of accomplishments, but as a gentle meditation on how one person can shape the way we see the world. She began in obscurity, a girl named Gabrielle, raised in an orphanage where the nuns taught her to sew. The steady rhythm of the needle through cloth became her first language, a quiet discipline that would stay with her always. From those humble beginnings, she climbed, not with the loud, dramatic gestures of a conqueror, but with the quiet determination of someone who knew the power of simplicity. She didn't just design clothes, she designed freedom. The corsets of her time were restrictive, heavy, like the expectations placed on women. Chanel took scissors to them, cutting away the excess, leaving only what was necessary. A little black dress, a boxy jacket, trousers for women, when such a thing was still scandalous. She didn't follow fashion, she changed it. And yet, for all her innovation, she was never reckless. Every choice was deliberate, every stitch purposeful. She understood that true elegance wasn't about extravagance, it was about ease. The way a woman should be able to move, to breathe, to live, without feeling weighed down by her own clothes. That was her gift, not just the garments themselves, but the philosophy behind them. Fashion wasn't decoration, it was a way of being. Her personal life was just as layered as her work. She loved deeply, sometimes recklessly, and her heartbreaks were as much a part of her story as her triumphs. There were wealthy patrons, artists, even rumors of wartime entanglements, stories that have been picked apart and debated for decades. But perhaps what matters most isn't the truth of those tales, but the way they remind us that even the most iconic figures were human. Chanel wasn't a flawless heroine. She was a woman who made mistakes, who carried regrets, who sometimes let pride or ambition guide her decisions. And yet, that only makes her more real, more relatable. Her legacy is everywhere, even now. Walk into any department store, and you'll see her influence. The little black dress hanging on a rack, the quilted handbag slung over a stranger's shoulder, the timeless simplicity of a well-cut blazer. But it's more than that. It's in the way women dress without thinking, in the freedom to choose comfort without sacrificing style. She didn't just create a look, she created a mindset. And then there's Chanel No. 5, the perfume that changed everything. Before it, fragrances were heavy, floral, overwhelming. Chanel wanted something different, something modern, something that smelled like a woman, not a garden. The result was clean, sharp, unforgettable, a scent that would become synonymous with sophistication. Even now, over a century later, it remains one of the most famous perfumes in the world. A single spritz carries her vision forward, a whisper of her influence that lingers in the air. The House of Chanel still stands, of course, a testament to her enduring vision. Designers have come and gone, each adding their own voice to the story, but the foundation she laid remains. The tweed suits, the pearls, the understated luxury, they all trace back to her. Yet, for all the brand's success, Chanel herself would likely shrug at the idea of being called a legend. She was too practical for that, too focused on the work itself. She didn't design for the future, she designed for the moment, trusting that if she stayed true to her instincts, the rest would follow. Tonight, as sleep pulls you closer, think of her not as a distant icon, but as a woman who sat at a work table late into the night, fingers smoothing fabric, eyes searching for the perfect line. Think of the way she must have felt when an idea finally came together, when a dress draped just right, when the world began to see what she saw. That's where the real magic lies, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent act of creation. Her life wasn't simple. It was messy, complicated, full of contradictions. But perhaps that's why she still fascinates us. She wasn't a fairy tale, she was real. And in her flaws, her struggles, her relentless drive, we see something of ourselves. So let your breathing slow, your thoughts soften. Imagine the faint scent of Chanel No. 5 in the air, the whisper of tweed against skin, the quiet click of pearls. The world she helped shape is all around us, woven into the fabric of everyday life. And as you drift into sleep, remember that even the grandest stories begin with small, ordinary moments. A needle pulling thread, an idea taking shape, a woman daring to imagine something new. Rest now, wrapped in the quiet comfort of history, knowing that some legacies never fade. They simply become part of us, like the softest cashmere or the gentlest lullaby. Close your eyes and let yourself dream of simpler lines, lighter fabrics, and the endless possibilities of a new day. Sleep